In a great stone kitchen where firelight dances across worn wooden tables, and the scent of simmering vegetables fills the warm air, a cook named Alice tends her largest cauldron with the patient attention of someone who has fed hundreds through countless winters. The year is 1342, and the first true cold has settled over the castle walls. Good evening. I am grateful you are here tonight. Tonight's story will carry us to a castle kitchen in the winter of 1342, where we will follow Alice, the head cook, through the long, peaceful hours of preparing a great stew that will warm the entire household. Let yourself settle in, get comfortable, and know that there is nowhere else you need to be. This story will be here, unfolding slowly for as long as you need. The kitchen had been Alice's domain for nearly 20 years now, and she knew every stone of its floor, every hook hanging from its ceiling beams, every way the light moved across the tables as the day progressed. This morning, before dawn had fully broken, she had come down the narrow stairs from her small room above the bakehouse, wrapped in her heavy wool cloak against the December cold, and begun the fire that now crackled steadily in the great hearth. The cauldron itself was a thing of substantial presence, iron black and large enough that Alice could barely reach her arms around its belly. It hung from a sturdy chain over the fire, and she had learned long ago exactly how high to suspend it so the contents would simmer without scorching, how to read the tiny bubbles that rose to the surface to know when the heat was just right. This was knowledge that lived in her hands and eyes rather than in words, learned through years of watching and doing until the work became as natural as breathing. She had begun by filling the cauldron nearly to its rim with water drawn fresh from the well that morning. Two of the kitchen boys had hauled the heavy buckets, making trip after trip while the sky was still gray with pre-dawn light, their breath visible in small clouds as they worked. The water had been cold enough to make her fingers ache when she tested it, but now, after an hour over the fire, it had warmed to a gentle heat, not yet bubbling but moving with subtle currents that caught the firelight. The vegetables waited on the long wooden table that dominated the center of the kitchen, and Alice moved to them with the ease of familiar routine. There were turnips, their rounded forms still bearing traces of the dark earth they had been pulled from just yesterday, stored in the root cellar that stayed cool and dry through all the seasons. She selected 6 of the largest, feeling their weight in her palm, their skin slightly rough against her fingers. The knife she reached for was one she had used for so many years that its wooden handle had worn smooth, shaped by her grip into a curve that fit her hand perfectly. She began to peel the first turnip, working in long, even strokes that removed the skin in pale ribbons. The exposed flesh beneath was cream-colored and firm, and she could smell the earthy sweetness that would, after hours of cooking, become mild and tender. Alice worked without hurry, letting her hands follow the patterns they had repeated countless times. Each turnip was peeled, then cut into pieces roughly the size of a hen's egg, not too small that they would fall apart in the long cooking, not too large that they would remain hard at the center. The pieces fell into a wide wooden bowl with soft thumping sounds, and she found herself falling into the rhythm of the work, peel and cut, while the fire crackled and the kitchen gradually grew lighter as morning advanced. When all the turnips were prepared, she moved to the carrots. These had come from the same root cellar, their bright orange color a cheerful contrast to the turnip's paleness. There were perhaps 20 of them, long and tapered, and she peeled each one with the same steady attention, watching the curls of peel fall away to reveal the deeper orange beneath. The carrots, too, were cut into substantial pieces, and their slight sweetness would balance the other flavors in the stew, a fact that Alice knew not from any teaching, but from the experience of making this stew through 20 winters. The onions were next, and she welcomed them despite knowing they would make her eyes water as they always did. There were 8 large onions, their papery skins rustling faintly as she gathered them. She had learned to peel them slowly, to pause and look away toward the fire when the stinging became too much, and to accept the tears that came as simply part of the work, no more remarkable than the ache that sometimes settled into her shoulders after a long day of stirring and lifting. She cut the onions into half-moon slices, her knife moving with practiced precision, and she could smell their sharp bite even before they were fully cut. They would, she knew, become sweet and nearly translucent in the long cooking, adding a depth to the stew that was essential even if it could not be easily named. The slices joined the other vegetables in their bowl, and Alice carried the whole lot to the cauldron. The water was beginning to show tiny bubbles now, the first signs of movement that meant the heat was building properly. She added the vegetables slowly, using both hands to guide them from the bowl into the water. They made gentle splashing sounds as they entered, and she watched them begin to settle, some sinking immediately, others floating for a moment before being pulled down by the current of the warming water. From the shelf that held her stores of dried herbs, Alice selected what she would need. There was thyme, its tiny leaves still clinging to their woody stems, dried from the summer's harvest. She crumbled several stems between her palms, releasing the herb's quiet fragrance, letting the leaves fall into the pot. Bay leaves came next, 3 of them, their dark green color only slightly faded by drying. She added them carefully, watching them float on the surface before gradually being pulled into the liquid's gentle circulation. Salt came from the large earthenware crock that sat on the shelf nearest the hearth, where it would stay dry. She used a wooden scoop to measure out several generous portions, adding them to the pot, and knowing that more could always be added later, but that too much at the beginning would overpower everything else. The salt would help draw out the flavors of the vegetables, would help the barley soften, and would make everything in the pot work together rather than remaining separate. The barley waited in a cloth sack, pale grains that would absorb the liquid and become tender, helping to thicken the stew and make it substantial enough to satisfy the appetites of the household. Alice measured out several large handfuls, letting the grains run through her fingers and fall into the pot with soft pattering sounds. They sank quickly, disappearing into the vegetables and water, and she knew they would need the better part of the day to become properly tender. She reached for her long wooden spoon, its handle as tall as her arm, worn smooth by years of stirring. She began to move it through the contents of the cauldron, not stirring vigorously, but rather gently encouraging everything to settle and begin to mingle. The spoon moved easily through the water, and she could feel the slight resistance of the vegetables as the spoon passed by them. The kitchen had grown fully light now, morning sun finding its way through the high windows, and falling in broad beams across the flagstone floor. The fire burned steadily, and Alice added another log, placing it carefully so it would catch and burn slowly, maintaining the even heat that the stew required. She watched the flames adjust to the new wood, curling around it and beginning to consume it with the same patient thoroughness that she brought to her cooking. There was a particular peace that came with this work Alice had found over the years. The kitchen, when she was alone in it like this, felt like a place set apart from the rush and business of the castle's daily life. Here, time moved differently, measured not by bells or by the sun's position, but by the gradual transformation of raw ingredients into something nourishing and warm. She could hear, distantly, the sounds of the castle waking, voices in the courtyard, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer from across the bailey, the barking of dogs. But they seemed far away, separated from this warm and fragrant space by more than just stone walls. She settled onto the tall stool that stood near the hearth, positioned so she could watch the pot without having to stand the entire time. Her feet, in their worn leather shoes, rested flat on the floor, and she felt the warmth from the fire reaching her, comfortable and steady. The stew would need hours yet before it was done, hours of gentle simmering during which she would check it regularly, would stir it occasionally, would add more water if needed, would taste and adjust the seasoning as the flavors developed and deepened. For now, though, there was nothing to do but let the fire do its work. Let the heat gradually coax sweetness from the vegetables and tenderness from the barley. Alice watched the surface of the liquid, seeing it begin to move more actively now, tiny bubbles rising and breaking, carrying with them the mingled scents of onion and thyme, of earth and grain. The light from the windows had reached the cauldron now, and she could see the way it made the dark iron gleam, the way the liquid inside caught and reflected it. The kitchen door opened, letting in a brief gust of cold air along with Margaret, one of the young kitchen maids who helped with the daily work. Margaret was perhaps 16, with quick hands and a willing spirit, and she had been working in the kitchen for nearly a year now, learning the rhythms and requirements of feeding a castle household. "Good morning, Alice," Margaret said, unwinding the shawl from around her shoulders and hanging it on its hook near the door. "The stew's begun already, I see." "Started it at first light," Alice replied, her voice carrying the mild contentment that came from work. "It'll need the whole day to come right." Margaret moved to the table and began gathering the peelings and scraps from Alice's work, collecting them into a basket that would be taken to the pigs later. Her movements were efficient, and Alice appreciated the girl's understanding that the kitchen worked best when it was kept tidy, when each task flowed naturally into the next. "What else needs doing?" Margaret asked, and Alice considered the question, running through the day's requirements in her mind. "The bread dough's rising in the warming cupboard," she said. "It'll be ready for shaping in another hour or so, and there's cheese to be sliced for the midday meal, and apples to be cored for baking this afternoon." Margaret nodded, beginning with the cheese, fetching the large wheel from the cool storage room and setting it on the table. She worked beside Alice in companionable silence, the kind of quiet that came from two people who knew their tasks and found no need to fill every moment with words. Alice rose from her stool and moved to the cauldron, taking up her long spoon once more to stir the contents. The water was properly simmering now, and she could see that the vegetables had begun to soften slightly at their edges. The barley was still firm and would remain so for hours yet, but it had begun to absorb the liquid, swelling slightly. She stirred slowly, moving the spoon in broad circles that reached to the bottom of the pot, ensuring nothing would settle and scorch on the iron surface. The warmth rising from the pot touched her face, and she breathed in the steam, reading it the way she might read a familiar text. Not yet fully developed, but beginning, the elements starting to work together. She added another pinch of salt, stirring it in, and returned to her stool, satisfied that all was progressing as it should. The morning continued its slow progression, marked not by any dramatic change, but by the subtle deepening of the stew's fragrance, the gradual softening of the vegetables, the way the light moved across the kitchen floor as the sun climbed higher. Alice found herself settling into the particular rhythm of a stew day, a rhythm she had known so many times that her body understood it without conscious thought. She moved between the cauldron and the other tasks that required attention, never straying far, always keeping part of her awareness on the pot and the fire beneath it. Every quarter hour or so, she would rise from her stool and stir, feeling through the spoon how the contents were changing, how the barley was beginning to release its starch and thicken the liquid slightly, how the vegetables were yielding to the heat. Margaret had finished slicing the cheese, arranging it on wooden platters that would be carried to the great hall when the midday meal was called. Now she was working on the apples, coring them with a small sharp knife, her movements quick and precise. The peels fell in long spirals, and the clean scent of the fruit added another layer to the kitchen's atmosphere, sweet and fresh against the deeper, earthier smell of the simmering stew. "My mother used to make a stew like this," Margaret said after a while, her voice soft with memory. "Every autumn when the weather turns. She'd start it in the morning, and by evening the whole house would smell of it." Alice nodded, not looking up from the fire she was tending. "It's a good smell," she said. "Tells people they're home, that there's warmth and food waiting." The girl smiled, continuing with her apples, and Alice thought about the truth of what she had said. Over her years in this kitchen, she had come to understand that her work was about more than simply preventing hunger. The smells that came from this room, the bread baking and the stew simmering, the herbs drying from the rafters and the onions hanging in their braids, all of it created a sense of comfort and security that went deeper than any single meal could provide. She added another log to the fire, watching the flames adjust and curl around the new wood. The heat needed to stay constant, neither too high nor too low. Too high and the stew would boil rather than simmer, the vegetables falling apart into mush, the liquid reducing too quickly. Too low and the barley would never properly soften, and would remain stubbornly chewy no matter how long it cooked. By mid-morning, the kitchen had grown busier. 2 of the kitchen boys had arrived, Thomas and young Peter, both still wearing the sleepy look of children roused too early but willing enough once they began their work. Thomas started hauling in more wood for the fire, stacking it neatly against the wall where Alice could reach it easily. Peter began sweeping the floor, his movements sending up small puffs of flour dust that caught the sunlight. Alice checked the bread dough in the warming cupboard, a small alcove built into the wall beside the great hearth, where the residual warmth from the fire kept things at just the right temperature for rising. The dough had swelled beautifully, pushing up against the cloth that covered it, and when she pressed a finger gently into its surface, the indentation remained, telling her it was ready for the next stage. She carried the large wooden bowl to the table and turned the dough out onto the floured surface. It landed with a soft, satisfying sound, pale and smooth and slightly cool to the touch. She began to work it, pressing it down with the heels of her hands, folding it over itself, feeling its texture transform from soft and yielding to something with more body and resistance. This was work her hands could do without much thought, leaving her mind free to wander, to notice the sounds of the kitchen around her, the crackle of the fire, the soft scrape of Peter's broom, the gentle bubbling from the cauldron, Margaret humming under her breath as she worked. All of it wove together into a kind of contentment that Alice had learned to recognize and value. These moments when everything in her domain was proceeding as it should. She divided the dough into portions for loaves, shaping each one with practiced motions, pulling the dough tight across the top to create tension that would help the bread rise properly during baking. The shaped loaves went onto wooden boards, covered again with cloth, set aside for their second rising. They would go into the oven later, when the morning's baking fire had died down to the proper temperature. Returning to the cauldron, she stirred again, more thoroughly this time, bringing the vegetables up from the bottom and letting them settle back down. The barley had swelled noticeably now, each grain plump and beginning to soften. The liquid had thickened slightly, taking on a more substantial quality. She tasted a small spoonful, blowing on it first to cool it, and considered what she found there. The flavors were still developing, still separate enough that she could identify each one. The sweetness of the carrots, the earthiness of the turnips, the sharp edge of the onion beginning to mellow, the thyme adding its quiet herbal note. But they were starting to merge, to become something unified rather than distinct. She added a little more salt, a generous grinding of black pepper from the wooden mill, and stirred it through. The castle bells rang for terce, the mid-morning office, and Alice heard them with the part of her attention that kept track of time. The household would gather in the chapel for prayers, and afterward there would be a brief break for light refreshment before the morning's work continued in earnest. She made sure there was ale set out in the buttery, and bread from yesterday's baking, and a small amount of cheese. Margaret went to help serve this small meal, and Alice was alone in the kitchen again for a brief while. She used the time to check her stores, running through in her mind what would be needed for the evening meal, for tomorrow's baking, for the days beyond. There was enough flour and salt, and the root vegetables would last well into winter. The dried beans and peas hung in their cloth sacks from the rafters, safe from mice. The herbs were plentiful. She had made sure of a good harvest last summer, gathering and drying them at their peak. She felt a quiet satisfaction in this accounting, in knowing that her stores were well managed, that she could feed the household through the winter ahead without want or waste. This was the foundation of her work, this careful attention to what was available and what was needed, to the rhythms of plenty and scarcity that governed the year. The stew had been cooking for 3 hours now, and the transformation was becoming more evident. The vegetables had softened considerably, the turnips yielding easily when she pressed them with the back of her spoon, the carrots tender but still holding their shape. The barley had absorbed a substantial amount of liquid and was now properly soft, each grain distinct but thoroughly cooked. The broth itself had taken on a rich, golden color, clouded slightly by the starch from the barley. She tasted it again, and this time the flavors had merged into something harmonious and complete. The individual elements were still there if she thought about them, but they worked together now, each one supporting and enhancing the others. It needed only a bit more time, she judged, another hour or two of gentle simmering to allow everything to settle and deepen further. Margaret returned, bringing news that the household had finished their prayers and their small meal and were dispersing to their various tasks. The castle was fully awake now, fully engaged with the day's business. Alice could hear more activity beyond the kitchen, voices calling instructions, footsteps on stone, the sound of horses in the courtyard as someone prepared to ride out. "Shall I start on the apples for baking?" Margaret asked, and Alice nodded, pleased that the girl anticipated the next task without needing to be told. Margaret had learned well, had absorbed not just the specific skills of cutting and stirring and shaping, but the broader understanding of how a kitchen moved through its day, how each task connected to the next in a continuous flow. The apples were cored and arranged in a large earthenware dish, and Margaret sprinkled them with honey that flowed thick and golden from the crock, with cinnamon brought from the spice stores kept locked in Alice's small room. The spices were precious, used sparingly, and Alice had learned to make them last, to use just enough to add their warmth and fragrance without overwhelming. The dish of apples would go into the oven after the bread came out, would bake slowly in the falling heat until they were soft and caramelized, their skins wrinkled and their flesh yielding and sweet. They would be served at the evening meal, a small treat as the days grew colder and darker. Alice added water to the stew, ladling it carefully from the bucket, watching the level rise back to where it should be. Some liquid always evaporated during the long cooking, carried away as steam, and it needed to be replaced to keep the stew from becoming too thick, from reducing down to something heavy and gluey rather than properly soup-like. She stirred once more, her movements slow and even, and then settled back onto her stool. The fire had burned down somewhat, and she judged it was right. No need to add wood just yet. The pot would continue its gentle simmer, the heat steady and sufficient. Thomas came to ask where she wanted the fresh herbs he had just cut from the garden, and she directed him to hang them from the hooks over the far table, where they would be out of the way but within easy reach when she needed them. He had brought rosemary and more thyme, and the fresh sage that she used for the bread dressing they would make later in the week. The herbs dripped slightly, having been rinsed in cold water, and their scent was sharp and clean, brightening the air. Alice watched Thomas hang them with his careful young hands, and she thought about how many young people she had helped train over the years. How many had started as he had, uncertain and eager, and had grown into competent workers who understood the importance of doing each task properly and with attention. The midday meal approached, signaled by the bells ringing for sext, and Alice knew the household would soon gather in the great hall. The meal would be simple, the bread and cheese that were already prepared, the cold meat from yesterday's roasting, some pickled vegetables from the stores. But even a simple meal required attention, required things to be carried and arranged, required her to oversee and ensure that all was as it should be. She left Margaret to watch the stew, giving her careful instructions to add wood to the fire if it began to burn too low, to stir every little while, to call immediately if anything seemed amiss. The girl nodded seriously, understanding that this was both trust and responsibility, and Alice left the kitchen knowing the work was in capable hands. The great hall was busy with people taking their places at the long tables, and Alice moved among them with the quiet authority of someone who had overseen countless meals. The bread was carried in on large wooden platters, the cheese alongside it, the meat sliced and arranged. Ale was poured into cups, and the castle chaplain said the blessing over the food. Alice stood to the side, watching, ready to direct if anything was needed, but the meal progressed smoothly. The household ate with the good appetite of people who had been working since dawn, and there was conversation and laughter, the comfortable sounds of a community at ease with itself. When the meal was finished and the tables cleared, Alice returned to her kitchen to find everything as it should be. Margaret had tended the fire and stirred the stew, and the girl looked pleased with herself, happy to have managed the responsibility well. Alice checked the pot and found the stew had continued to develop beautifully in her absence, the flavors even more married, the vegetables completely tender. "You did well," she told Margaret, and saw the girl's face brighten at the praise. It cost nothing to acknowledge good work Alice had learned, and it made all the difference in helping young workers grow in confidence and skill. The afternoon stretched ahead, quieter now. The main tasks of the day were complete or well in hand, and there was a lull, a breathing space before the evening meal would need to begin its preparation. Alice used this time to attend to smaller things, mending a tear in one of the kitchen clothes, checking that the knives were properly sharp, wiping down the long wooden table until it was clean and ready for the next day's work. The stew continued its patient transformation, and Alice checked it regularly, stirring it through, watching the light from the windows change as the sun moved across the sky. The kitchen was warm and fragrant, and she felt the particular satisfaction that came from a day's work proceeding exactly as planned, each task completed at the right time and in the right way. By mid-afternoon, she judged the stew was nearly ready. She tasted it one final time, considering carefully, and found it had reached that point of perfect balance and depth that could not be rushed or forced, that came only from patient time over gentle heat. The vegetables were tender without being mushy. The barley was soft and had released enough starch to give the broth body, and the flavors had become rich and unified and thoroughly satisfying. She removed the pot from the direct heat, using thick cloths to protect her hands as she worked with Thomas to lift it and swing it to the side, where it would stay warm without continuing to cook. It would hold at this temperature until the evening meal, and if anything, the extra time would only allow the flavors to settle further, to become even more harmonious. The bread went into the oven, and Alice watched the loaves carefully, knowing from years of experience exactly how they should look when they were done. Golden brown across the top, firm when tapped on the bottom, making a hollow sound that told her the interior was properly baked through. The apples followed when the bread came out, going into the falling heat to bake slowly through the rest of the afternoon. As the light began to fade and the day moved toward evening, Alice felt that deep tiredness that came from steady work, from hours spent on her feet, from the continuous attention that her work required. But it was a good tiredness, the kind that came with accomplishment, with knowing that she had done her work well, and that the household would be fed with food that was nourishing and good. The evening bells rang for vespers, and Alice heard them with the satisfaction of someone whose day's main work was complete. The stew sat ready in its cauldron, still warm from the fire, its surface occasionally rippling with the gentle movement of settling heat. The bread had cooled on its racks, filling the kitchen with that incomparable scent of fresh baking that never grew old no matter how many thousands of loaves she had made. The apples were soft in their dish, their skins wrinkled and glossy with honey. Margaret had gone to help set the tables in the great hall, and the kitchen boys were bringing in fresh rushes to spread on the floor, replacing the old ones that had become compressed and dusty with the day's traffic. Alice watched them work, noting how Peter was growing taller, how his movements were becoming less clumsy, more assured. In another year or two, he would be ready to take on more responsibility, perhaps to train as a proper cook rather than simply a helper. She moved to the cauldron and stirred the stew one more time, slowly, bringing the wooden spoon through the depths of the pot and up again. The vegetables and barley moved easily in the thickened broth, and the steam that rose carried the full depth of the day's cooking, all the flavors woven together into something that was greater than the sum of its parts. From the storage shelves, she took down wooden bowls, stacking them on the table in preparation for serving. There would be perhaps 50 people to feed tonight. The castle household, the men-at-arms, the servants, the visiting merchant who had arrived that afternoon seeking shelter for the night. 50 bowls of stew, bread for each person, ale to drink, and the baked apples to follow. Thomas helped her carry the cauldron back over the fire, just close enough to keep it warm without letting it continue to cook. The weight of it required both their strengths, and they moved carefully, setting it down with precision. Alice had seen what could happen when such tasks were done carelessly, had known kitchens where boiling liquid had spilled and caused terrible burns. She was vigilant about safety, insistent that heavy things be lifted properly, that hot things be handled with respect and care. The castle steward appeared in the doorway, a thin man named Robert who oversaw the smooth running of the household. He nodded to Alice with the respect that came from years of working together, of understanding that they each had their domain and their expertise. "Will the meal be ready when called?" he asked, though it was more confirmation than question. Alice had never failed to have a meal ready at the proper time in all her years of service. "Ready now," she replied. "The stew is at its best, the bread is fresh, the apples are warm." "Good," Robert said. "The Lord is in good spirits tonight. The merchant brought news of good prices for our wool. It should be a pleasant evening." He departed to oversee the hall, and Alice felt a quiet pleasure at his words. She took pride in her work not for praise or recognition, though those were welcome enough, but for the simple satisfaction of doing it well, of contributing to the household's well-being and comfort. When people gathered around good food, when they were warm and fed, the whole atmosphere of the castle improved. Tempers were easier, conversations more pleasant, the sense of community stronger. Margaret returned and began ladling the stew into a large serving tureen that would be carried to the high table where the Lord and his family sat. Alice supervised, making sure each ladle brought up a good mixture of vegetables and barley and broth, that the servings were generous but not wasteful. The tureen, when filled, was heavy, and two of the serving boys carried it between them, moving carefully through the doorway and toward the great hall. More bowls were filled for the lower tables, carried out in groups, and Alice could hear the sounds of appreciation as people began to eat, the good sounds of hunger being satisfied. She filled a bowl for herself and one for Margaret, and they sat together at the kitchen table, eating their own meal in the relative quiet now that the main serving was done. The stew was everything Alice had intended it to be. The broth was rich and warming, tasting of all the hours it had spent over the fire, all the careful additions of salt and herbs and thyme. The vegetables were soft enough to eat easily but still maintained their individual character, the carrots with their sweetness, the turnips with their mild earthiness, the onions now translucent and tender. The barley provided substance, making each spoonful satisfying and filling. "This is very good," Margaret said after a few moments, and Alice smiled. "It's the time to do it," she said. "You cannot rush a stew. It needs the hours to become what it should be." Margaret nodded, understanding, and they ate in comfortable silence, both tired from the day's work but content with what had been accomplished. Through the open doorway, Alice could hear the buzz of conversation from the great hall, could hear laughter and the clink of cups being raised and set down. It was the sound of a household at ease, well-fed and comfortable, and it was a sound she had helped create. When they had finished eating, there was still work to be done. The bread needed to be wrapped in clean cloth to keep it fresh for tomorrow's breakfast. The apples needed to be carried to the hall for the final course. The cauldron would need to be cleaned once it was empty, scrubbed out and hung to dry. The knives needed to be wiped and put away. The table needed to be cleared and cleaned for the morning's work. But these tasks felt lighter somehow, easier to approach now that the main work of the day was complete. Alice moved through them with the practiced efficiency of a long habit, and Margaret worked alongside her, the two of them settling the kitchen back into order. The serving boys brought back the empty tureen and reported that the Lord had asked to send his compliments to the cook. Alice received this news with a nod, pleased but not surprised. She knew the stew had been good, had known it from the moment she tasted it, and found the flavors perfectly balanced. Still, it was gratifying to have the work recognized, to know that her efforts had brought pleasure and satisfaction. The last of the baked apples were carried out, and Alice could imagine them being set before the diners, still warm, their honey glaze catching the candlelight. They would be sweet and comforting, a gentle end to the meal that would leave people feeling satisfied and content as they prepared for the evening's rest. The fire in the great hearth had burned down to glowing coals, and Alice banked it carefully for the night, arranging the remaining wood so it would smolder slowly until morning, when it would be built up again for the new day's cooking. The kitchen was growing darker as the light outside faded completely, and she lit the candles that would provide illumination for the final cleaning tasks. Margaret swept the floor one last time, gathering the day's accumulation of vegetable peelings and flour dust and crumbs. The kitchen boys carried out the scraps to the pigs, who would feast on the turnip peels and apple cores with as much enthusiasm as the household had shown for the finished dishes. Nothing was wasted in a well-run kitchen, Alice believed. What could not be eaten by people could feed animals, and what animals would not eat could go to enrich the garden soil. The cauldron was empty now, and Alice and Thomas worked together to lift it down from its hook, setting it on the floor where it could be more easily cleaned. She poured hot water from the kettle into it, adding a handful of sand and a stiff brush, and began to scrub the interior, removing any bits of vegetable or grain that had stuck to the sides during the long cooking. The iron was smooth and well seasoned from years of use, and it cleaned easily under her practiced attention. When the pot was clean and rinsed, they hung it back on its hook to dry overnight. In the morning, it would be ready to use again, for soup or porridge or whatever the day required. Alice ran her hand over its surface one final time, feeling the slight warmth that still lingered from the day's fire, the smoothness of the well-maintained iron. The kitchen was settling into its nighttime quiet now. Margaret had finished her sweeping and was banking the smaller cooking fire, covering the coals with ash so they would keep until morning without burning through all the fuel. The boys had completed their tasks and been dismissed to their own rest. The candles cast gentle shadows across the clean tables and the swept floor, across the herbs hanging from their hooks and the bread wrapped in its cloths. Alice walked slowly through the kitchen, checking each area with the thoroughness of a long habit. The knives were put away, the bowls stacked properly, the clothes hung to dry, the doors to the storage rooms secured. Everything was as it should be, ready for tomorrow's work to begin. She paused by the window, looking out into the darkness of the courtyard. She could see a few lights still burning in other parts of the castle, could hear the distant sound of the guards calling to each other as they changed watch. The night was clear and cold, and she could see stars scattered across the sky like seeds broadcast across dark earth. Tomorrow there would be more meals to prepare, more bread to bake, more tasks that would fill the hours from dawn until dusk. But that was tomorrow, and it would come in its own time. For now, this day was complete, its work finished and finished well. The household had been fed with food that had nourished both body and spirit, and Alice felt the deep satisfaction that came from work done with care and attention and skill. She climbed the narrow stairs to her small room above the bakehouse, carrying a candle to light her way. The room was simple, containing only a bed with warm blankets, a chest for her few possessions, a small table and stool. But it was her space, quiet and private, and she was grateful for it. The blankets were cold when she first slipped beneath them, but they quickly captured her warmth, and she felt herself beginning to relax fully for the first time since rising before dawn. Her hands still carried the faint scent of onions and herbs, of bread dough and wood smoke, the smells that marked her life and her work. She thought about the stew, about how it had transformed over the course of the day from separate ingredients into something unified and complete. There was a lesson in that, she thought drowsily, about patience and time and the value of attention to small details, about how good things could not be rushed but needed to develop at their own pace, in their own time. The castle was quiet around her, settling into the rhythms of night. Somewhere below, the fire she had banked would be glowing softly, ready to be brought back to life in the morning. The bread she had wrapped would be waiting for tomorrow's breakfast. The clean cauldron would be ready for whatever cooking the new day required. But for now, there was only the darkness and the quiet and the comfort of knowing that her work was done, that she had done it well, that tomorrow would bring its own tasks and its own satisfactions. Alice let her eyes close, let her breathing slow and deepen, let the tiredness in her muscles settle into something peaceful and restful. The winter night continued outside her window, cold and clear and still, and inside her small room, wrapped in her warm blankets, Alice drifted toward sleep with the contentment of someone who had spent the day exactly as it should be spent, in work that mattered and was done with care. The morning came gently, as winter mornings did in the castle, with darkness giving way slowly to gray light that crept through the small window of Alice's room. She woke before the bells rang for lauds, as she always did, her body attuned to the rhythms of the kitchen's needs even in sleep. For a moment she lay still beneath the blankets, feeling their warmth, listening to the quiet of the castle in these hours before dawn. Then she rose, as she had risen on countless mornings before, and dressed in the dim light. Her woolen dress was heavy and warm, practical for the work ahead, and she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders before descending the narrow stairs to the kitchen below. The fire she had banked the night before was still alive, glowing red beneath its covering of ash. She uncovered it carefully, added kindling in small pieces, and watched as the flames began to catch and grow. The kitchen was cold, her breath visible in small clouds, but the fire would soon change that, would bring warmth spreading through the room as it had every morning for as long as she could remember. She drew water from the well in the courtyard, the bucket handle cold enough to make her fingers ache, and carried it back to begin heating for the morning porridge. The routine of these tasks was comforting in its familiarity, each action flowing naturally into the next without need for conscious thought. Her hands knew what to do, her feet carried her where she needed to go, and her mind was free to settle into the peaceful awareness of work beginning. The oats for the porridge were kept in a large ceramic crock, and she measured them out into the pot that now hung over the growing fire. The water she added gradually, stirring as she poured, watching the mixture begin to thicken as the heat worked through it. Porridge was simpler than stew, requiring less time and fewer ingredients, but it still deserved attention and care. Lumpy porridge or porridge that had scorched on the bottom was a poor start to anyone's day. Margaret arrived as the sky was beginning to show the first true signs of dawn, a faint lightening along the eastern horizon. The girl looked sleepy still, but she moved to her tasks without complaint, beginning to slice the bread from yesterday's baking, setting out the butter and honey that would accompany it. "Good morning," Alice said, and Margaret returned the greeting with a small smile, warming her hands briefly by the fire before continuing her work. The porridge thickened slowly, and Alice stirred it at regular intervals, scraping the spoon along the bottom of the pot to prevent any sticking. She added a generous pinch of salt, a handful of dried fruit that had been soaking overnight in a bowl of water, raisins and chopped apples that would add sweetness and texture to the plain oats. The kitchen boys arrived, bringing more wood, and the kitchen began to fill with the sounds and movements of morning work. Thomas stoked the bread oven, preparing it for the day's baking. Peter began setting out bowls for the porridge, counting them carefully to make sure there would be enough for everyone who would come seeking breakfast. The bells rang for lauds, and Alice knew that in the chapel the household would be gathering for the first prayers of the day. She continued her work, knowing that when the prayers ended, people would come to the kitchen seeking the warmth of food and fire before beginning their own tasks. The porridge reached the perfect consistency, thick enough to coat the spoon but still fluid enough to pour easily into bowls. Alice moved it to the side of the fire where it would stay warm without continuing to cook, and she tasted a small spoonful to check the seasoning. The oats were tender, the dried fruit had softened and released its sweetness, and the overall effect was simple and satisfying, exactly what a cold winter morning required. People began to arrive, taking their bowls of porridge and their bread, sitting at the long tables in the hall or carrying their food to eat while they worked. Alice served each person with the same attention, making sure the portions were generous, that each bowl received some of the fruit that made the plain porridge more interesting. There was John the groom, who always ate quickly before hurrying back to the stables. There was Emma the chambermaid, who preferred her porridge with extra honey. There was Father Benedict the chaplain, who always offered a quiet blessing before he ate. Alice knew them all, knew their preferences and their habits, and she took a quiet pleasure in being able to provide for them in these small, particular ways. When the first rush of breakfast was finished and the kitchen grew quieter again, Alice sat with her own bowl of porridge, eating slowly, letting the warmth of the food spread through her. Margaret sat across from her, and they ate in comfortable silence, both still settling fully into wakefulness, both knowing that the day ahead would be full of its own tasks and requirements. "What shall we make today?" Margaret asked after a while, and Alice considered the question, running through the stores in her mind, thinking about what the household would need. "There's meat that needs to be roasted for this evening," she said, "and we should make more bread, and perhaps a pottage with the beans that have been soaking. Something simple, something that can cook slowly while we attend to other things." Margaret nodded, and when they had finished eating, they began the day's work in earnest. The bread dough was mixed and set to rise. The meat was prepared and seasoned. The beans were combined with onions and herbs in a pot that would simmer gently for hours. The kitchen settled into its rhythms, and Alice moved through her tasks with the ease of long practice. There was a particular quality to this work that she had come to value deeply over the years, the way it required both attention and allowed for a certain kind of mental quiet, the way her hands could be busy while her thoughts drifted peacefully, the way each completed task led naturally to the next. She shaped the bread dough into loaves, her hands pressing and pulling, creating the tension in the dough that would help it rise tall and even. The motion was meditative, repeated so many times that her muscles remembered it without conscious direction. Each loaf took shape under her hands, smooth and rounded, ready for its final rise before baking. Margaret was working on preparing vegetables for the evening meal, and Alice watched her with approval. The girl had learned to hold the knife properly, to cut with steady, even strokes, to work efficiently without rushing. It was satisfying to see skills being passed on, to know that the knowledge she had accumulated over decades was finding a home in younger, capable hands. The morning progressed, measured by the movement of light across the kitchen floor, by the completion of tasks, by the bells that rang for terce and marked the passage of time. The bread went into the oven, and Alice monitored it carefully, checking the color, testing the firmness, knowing from experience exactly when to remove it so it would be perfectly done. The beans in their pot had softened and begun to absorb the flavors of the herbs and onions. Alice tasted them, added a touch more salt, a grind of pepper, and stirred them through. They would continue to cook until the midday meal, becoming tender and flavorful, another simple but satisfying dish that would help sustain the household through the day's work. By mid-morning, the meat was ready to go on the spit in the great hearth. It was a substantial piece of beef, and it would need several hours of slow turning over the coals to cook through properly. Thomas took charge of this task, settling himself on a stool near the hearth with a long rod that he could use to turn the spit at regular intervals. Alice showed him how to test the meat's progress by pressing it gently with a spoon, feeling for the give that indicated doneness, and how to baste it with its own drippings to keep it moist and flavorful. The boy listened carefully, understanding that he was being trusted with an important task, and she left him to it with confidence that he would manage well. The kitchen was warm now from the various fires, and fragrant with the mingling scents of baking bread and roasting meat and simmering beans. Alice paused for a moment, simply breathing it in, appreciating the way all these different elements combine to create the particular atmosphere of a working kitchen. There was always something that needed attention, a pot to be stirred, a fire to be tended, a vegetable to be chopped, a cloth to be folded. But there was also a rhythm to it all, a flow that made the work feel less like a series of separate tasks and more like one continuous, coherent activity. Alice had learned to move with this flow, to anticipate what would be needed next, to arrange her work so that everything came together at the right time without rush or strain. Margaret was proving adept at understanding this rhythm as well. She moved from task to task with increasing confidence, and Alice noticed that she was beginning to anticipate needs without being told, fetching a bowl before Alice asked for it, adding wood to the fire at just the right moment, wiping down the table between tasks to keep the workspace clear. The bells rang for sext, marking midday, and Alice knew that the household would soon gather for the main meal of the day. The bread was ready, cooled enough to slice. The beans were tender and savory. There was cheese from the stores and the cold remainder of yesterday's stew and ale to drink. It was a good, substantial meal, the kind that would provide energy for the afternoon's work. She supervised the serving, making sure everything was carried out properly, that the portions were appropriate, that nothing was forgotten. The castle steward appeared again, nodding his approval at the food laid out, and Alice felt the same quiet satisfaction she had known the evening before, the satisfaction of work done well, of a household provided for. When the meal was finished and the tables cleared, Alice returned to her kitchen to find the afternoon stretching ahead with its own set of tasks. The evening meal would need preparation, certainly, but there was time for other work as well. The mending of kitchen linens, the sorting of dried beans to remove any that were spoiled, the checking of stores to make sure nothing was running low. She settled into this quieter work, sitting at the table with her mending basket, threading her needle with coarse thread that would hold strong through repeated washings. The tears in the clothes were small, the result of ordinary wear, and she stitched them closed with even, careful stitches that would make them serviceable again. Margaret worked beside her, sorting through the beans, spreading them on the table and examining each one, setting aside any that were shriveled or discolored. The afternoon light that came through the high windows was softer than the morning's brightness, a gentler illumination that made the kitchen feel peaceful and contained. Alice continued her mending, finding a rhythm in the simple back and forth of the needle through fabric, the slight resistance of the cloth giving way to each careful stitch. There was something deeply satisfying about mending, about taking something torn or worn and making it whole again, extending its useful life through attention and care. The beans that Margaret sorted made small clicking sounds as she moved them across the table, separating the good from the few that needed to be discarded. It was patient work, requiring attention but not strain, and the girl had settled into it with the calm focus that Alice valued. These quieter tasks were important too, Alice believed. Not every moment needed to be filled with urgent activity. There was value in work that allowed the mind to rest while the hands stayed busy. Thomas continued his steady turning of the meat on the spit, and Alice checked on him periodically, observing the way the beef was browning evenly, the fat rendering and dripping into the pan below where it could be saved for other cooking. The boy was doing well, maintaining the regular rotation that ensured the meat would cook through without burning on any side. "You're managing that nicely," she told him, and he looked pleased at the acknowledgement, sitting a bit straighter on his stool. The roasting meat filled the kitchen with its rich aroma, different from yesterday's stew but equally appealing in its own way. Alice thought about how food could mark time, how the smells and tastes of different dishes could orient a person within the flow of days and seasons. The stew had been appropriate for yesterday, hearty and warming, using vegetables from the root cellar. Today's roast was a different kind of sustenance, more substantial, the kind of meal that would be remembered and appreciated. She finished the last of her mending and folded the repaired clothes, stacking them neatly on the shelf where they would be ready when needed. Her hands moved automatically to the next task, checking the bread that would be needed for the evening meal, making sure there was enough, deciding whether more needed to be baked or if what remained from the morning would suffice. There was enough, she determined. The household had not been as large today as sometimes it was, with several of the men-at-arms having ridden out that morning on some errand for the Lord. Fewer people meant less bread consumed, and what remained would be fresh enough for the evening meal and tomorrow's breakfast besides. Margaret had finished sorting the beans and was now wiping down the long table, her cloth moving in broad, even strokes across the wood. The girl worked thoroughly, Alice noticed, not rushing through the task but giving it the attention it deserved. A clean workspace was essential in a kitchen, not just for appearance but for safety and efficiency. Spills could cause slips, crumbs could attract mice, and disorder could lead to mistakes. "When you've finished there," Alice said, "we should check the herb stores and see what needs replenishing." They walked together to the small room where the dried herbs hung from the rafters and where various other stores were kept. The precious spices in their locked chest, the salt in its crock, the honey in sealed vessels. The room smelled of all these things combined, a concentrated version of the scents that always filled the kitchen. Alice examined each bundle of herbs, feeling their dryness, checking for any signs of mold or deterioration. The time was running low, she noticed, and made a mental note to have Thomas cut more from the garden if the weather stayed dry enough. The rosemary was plentiful still, its woody stems holding their needles well even in dried form. The sage was adequate, the bay leaves numerous. She showed Margaret how to check for quality, how to crumble a small amount between the fingers and smell it to determine if the herb still held its potency or had faded with time. Fresh herbs from the garden were always preferable when available, but in winter, the dried stores were essential, and knowing their condition was part of managing the kitchen well. "This parsley has gone too dusty," Alice said, pulling down a bundle that had lost its color and fragrance. "It can go to the pigs. We'll need to dry more when spring comes and the garden grows fresh again." Margaret nodded, learning, and they continued their inventory, checking each item methodically. It was the kind of task that seemed small but mattered significantly, knowing what you had, what you needed, what could be used, and what should be discarded. These were the foundations of good kitchen management, less visible than the cooking itself, but equally important. When they returned to the main kitchen, Alice found that the meat had progressed well in their absence. The exterior was a deep, appetizing brown, and when she pressed it gently with the back of a spoon, she could feel that it was nearly done, still slightly yielding but firming up as the heat worked through to the center. Another half hour, she judged, and it would be perfect. She prepared a platter for the meat, a large wooden board that could hold the roast while it rested before carving. Meat always needed to rest after cooking. She had learned long ago, needed time for the juices to settle and distribute evenly through the flesh. Cut it too soon, and those juices would run out onto the board, leaving the meat dry and less flavorful. The beans from the midday meal had been kept warm by the fire, and she stirred them, finding they had continued to soften and develop flavor through the afternoon. There would be plenty for the evening meal, along with the roast beef and bread, and perhaps some of the pickled vegetables from the stores to add brightness to the plate. As the afternoon drew toward evening, the kitchen began to fill again with activity. The serving boys appeared, ready to help carry food to the hall. Peter swept the floor once more, removing the day's accumulation of crumbs and dust. Margaret began setting out the serving platters and bowls, arranging everything in the order it would be needed. Alice removed the meat from the spit with Thomas's help, transferring it carefully to the waiting platter. The beef was beautiful, evenly browned and fragrant, and she set it aside to rest while the final preparations were completed. Steam rose from it in gentle wisps, carrying the rich scent of roasted meat throughout the kitchen. She sliced bread, arranged it in baskets, made sure the butter and salt were ready to accompany it. The beans were ladled into serving bowls, their liquid thick and savory from the long cooking. Everything was coming together as it should, each element ready at the proper time, the result of planning and attention and experience. The bells rang for vespers, and Alice knew the household would be gathering for prayers before the evening meal. She used this brief interval to check everything one final time, to make sure nothing had been forgotten, that all was prepared and ready. The meat had rested long enough now, and she began to carve it, her knife moving smoothly through the tender flesh, creating slices that were neither too thick nor too thin. The slices were arranged on platters, and Alice looked at them with the critical eye of someone who took pride in presentation as well as taste. The meat was perfectly cooked, rosy at the center and brown at the edges, each slice showing the grain of the beef clearly. It would be tender and flavorful, she knew, the result of good meat and patient cooking and proper attention throughout the process. When the household came from the chapel, the serving began. The high table received their portions first, the best slices of meat, the freshest bread, the first serving of beans. Then the lower tables were served, and finally the kitchen staff took their own portions, sitting at their table to eat while the great hall buzzed with conversation and the sounds of a meal in progress. Alice ate her own dinner with appreciation, tasting in each bite the work of the day, the careful seasoning, the patient turning of the spit, the slow cooking of the beans. The meat was indeed tender, requiring little chewing, its flavor rich and satisfying. The beans provided a different texture, soft and savory, and the bread was perfect for sopping up the juices and sauce. Margaret ate quietly beside her, and Thomas and Peter sat across the table, all of them tired from the day's work but content with what had been accomplished. There was a companionship in sharing this meal together, in being part of a team that had worked toward a common purpose and achieved it well. "The meat is very good," Margaret said, and Alice nodded her agreement. "Thomas did well with the turning," she said, and the boy's face brightened at the recognition. "Even cooking makes all the difference." They finished their meal without rushing, taking time to enjoy the food and to rest before the evening's cleaning work would begin. Alice felt the familiar tiredness in her shoulders and back, the result of a full day spent on her feet, lifting and stirring and moving constantly. But it was an honest tiredness, earned through useful work, and she wore it comfortably. The cleaning proceeded in its orderly fashion once the meal was complete. The platters were scraped and washed, the bowls stacked, the table wiped clean. The knives were sharpened and put away, the clothes hung to dry. The fire was banked for the night, arranged so it would keep until morning without consuming all the fuel. Alice walked through the kitchen one final time as darkness settled fully outside the windows, checking each area with the thoroughness that had become automatic over years of practice. Everything was in its place, ready for tomorrow's work. The kitchen was clean and ordered, peaceful in its nighttime quiet. She climbed the stairs to her room, carrying her candle, feeling the day settling into her bones with a weight that was not unpleasant. The room was cold initially, but she had learned to dress for bed quickly, slipping under the blankets before the chill could penetrate too deeply. The blankets captured her warmth, and she felt herself relaxing into them, her body grateful for the rest. Tomorrow would bring its own tasks, more bread to bake, more meals to prepare, more of the continuous work that kept the household fed and functioning. But tomorrow was still hours away, and for now there was only the darkness and the quiet and the comfort of knowing that today's work was complete. She thought drowsily about the pattern of the days, how they followed one after another, each similar but never quite identical, each requiring the same attention and care. There was something deeply reassuring about this pattern, about knowing what would be needed and being able to provide it, about being part of a household's daily life in this essential, sustaining way. The castle settled around her into its nighttime rhythms. Somewhere a door closed softly. The wind moved past her window with a sound like breathing. The banked fire in the kitchen below glowed quietly in the darkness, waiting for morning. Alice let her eyes close, let her thoughts drift into the borderland between waking and sleep. Her hands, even at rest, still carried the sense memory of the day's work, the texture of bread dough, the weight of the stirring spoon, the heat rising from the fire. These were the touchstones of her life, the familiar elements that made each day feel purposeful and complete. The winter night continued outside, cold and clear, while inside her small room Alice drifted deeper into rest, her breathing slow and even, her body surrendering gratefully to sleep after a day of good, honest work well done. The days that followed took on a rhythm that Alice knew well, the rhythm of deep winter when the world outside the castle walls grew quiet and still, and life turned inward to the warmth of hearths, and the steady work that filled the short hours of daylight and the long evenings beside the fire. Each morning she woke in darkness and descended to the kitchen to wake the fire from its banked coals. Each morning she drew water and began the porridge, measured out flour for bread, planned the day's meals according to what the stores held and what the season allowed. The work was repetitive, yes, but Alice had long ago learned that repetition could be its own kind of comfort, a steady pattern that anchored the days and gave them structure and meaning. Margaret arrived each morning with increasing confidence, no longer hesitant about which tasks to begin, moving instead directly to what needed doing. Alice watched the girl's growing competence with satisfaction, seeing in her the same progression she had witnessed in other young workers over the years, the gradual accumulation of skills and knowledge, the development of judgment and timing, the understanding of how all the kitchen's various tasks fit together into a coherent whole. One morning, perhaps 3 days after the beef roast, Alice found herself preparing a different kind of meal. The weather had turned even colder, and she decided that a thick pea soup would be appropriate, something that would warm people from the inside and provide lasting sustenance against the chill. She had soaked the dried peas overnight, and now they sat in their bowl, swollen and ready for cooking. She poured them into the large pot, added water, and set them over the fire to begin their long transformation from hard and separate into soft and unified. To them, she added the bone from the beef roast, still carrying scraps of meat and rich with marrow, which would give the soup depth and body. While the peas began their slow cooking, Alice turned her attention to bread. The dough from yesterday's final rising had been kept cool overnight, and now she brought it to the warm kitchen and began to work it, pressing out the air that had formed during its rest, shaping it into rounds that would become the day's loaves. Her hands moved through the dough with practiced ease, and she found herself thinking about how many loaves she had shaped over the years, how many thousands of times she had performed this exact sequence of motions. The number was beyond counting, but each loaf still deserved the same care and attention as the first she had ever made, back when she was younger than Margaret was now, learning from the cook who had held this position before her. That cook had been named Joan, Alice remembered, a woman with strong arms and a quick laugh who had taken young Alice under her instruction without complaint or impatience. Joan had taught her how to feel when dough was properly kneaded, how to judge an oven's heat by holding her hand inside for a count of 3, how to taste a dish and know what it needed without measuring or calculating. All of that knowledge lived in Alice now, passed on through demonstration and practice, and she was passing it forward in turn to Margaret. The bread went into the oven, and Alice returned to the soup, stirring it to prevent the peas from settling and sticking to the bottom of the pot. They were beginning to soften already, their skins starting to split, releasing their starch into the liquid. She added onions that she had chopped fine, and carrots cut small, and a handful of the dried thyme that she had checked just days before. Thomas appeared with wood for the fires, and she directed him to stack it near but not too close to the hearth, where it would dry slightly from the ambient heat, but would not be in danger of catching a stray spark. The boy worked carefully, and Alice noticed that he was growing not just taller but more thoughtful, taking time to consider how best to arrange the logs so they would be stable and easy to reach. "You're learning to think ahead," she told him, and he looked pleased at the observation. Margaret was preparing vegetables for storage, trimming the wilted outer leaves from cabbages and checking them for any signs of rot that would need to be cut away. It was important work, this constant monitoring of the stores, making sure that nothing spoiled and spread its decay to neighboring vegetables. A good kitchen keeper was always vigilant about such things, always checking and sorting and removing anything that showed signs of deterioration. The morning progressed in its established pattern, and Alice found herself appreciating the way each person in the kitchen understood their role and performed it without needing constant direction. This was the result of time and training, of working together long enough that the rhythms became natural and intuitive. She could attend to the soup while Margaret managed the vegetables, while Thomas kept the fires fed, while Peter swept and cleaned, and everything would proceed smoothly because each person knew their part. By midday, the pea soup had thickened beautifully, the peas having broken down into a creamy consistency that was punctuated by the pieces of carrot and onion. Alice removed the bone, scraping off the bits of meat that clung to it and returning those to the pot, while the bone itself went to be boiled again for a lighter broth later in the week. Nothing was wasted, she thought again. Bones could give their richness multiple times if treated properly. She tasted the soup and found it needed salt, needed pepper, needed perhaps a touch more time. She added these adjustments carefully, stirring them through, tasting again until the balance felt right. The soup was substantial and warming, exactly what the cold day called for, and she ladled it into bowls for the midday meal with the satisfaction of knowing it would be well received. The bread that accompanied the soup was golden and crusty, and Alice sliced it while it was still faintly warm, each slice releasing a small puff of steam. There was butter spread on the bread, and people did so generously, the fat melting into the warm crumb and making each bite rich and satisfying. The afternoon brought different work. Alice decided to make pastry, something sweet to break the monotony of winter meals. She had dried apples and a store of honey, and she could make small pies that would bake quickly and provide a pleasant surprise at the evening meal. She made the pastry dough with cold butter and flour, working it just enough to bring it together, but not so much that it would become tough. Her hands were cool from the winter air, which helped keep the butter from melting into the flour too quickly. A happy accident of the season that made pastry making easier than it would be in summer's heat. Margaret watched with interest as Alice rolled out the dough, showing her how to work quickly and lightly, how to use just enough flour to prevent sticking but not so much that the pastry would become dry. The girl tried her hand at it, and though her rolling was less even than Alice's, she was learning, and that was what mattered. They cut circles of pastry and filled them with the dried apples that had been chopped and mixed with honey and a pinch of cinnamon. Each little pie was folded and sealed, and Alice showed Margaret how to crimp the edges to ensure they would stay closed during baking. The finished pies were arranged on a baking sheet, and Alice used a knife to cut small slits in the top of each one, allowing steam to escape during cooking. Into the oven they went, and Alice monitored them carefully, knowing that small pies could go from perfectly golden to burnt in a matter of minutes if not watched closely. The smell that began to fill the kitchen was wonderful, butter and fruit and spice combining into something that spoke of comfort and care. When the pies emerged, golden and fragrant, Alice set them to cool on racks, and even she had to admit they looked appealing. Margaret was openly delighted with them, proud of her contribution to their creation, and Alice felt again that satisfaction of passing on knowledge, of seeing someone younger learn and grow in capability. The evening meal was simple, more of the pea soup, which had only improved from sitting through the afternoon bread and cheese, and then the small pies for a sweet ending. Alice served them warm, and she saw people's faces brighten when they appeared, and heard the small sounds of pleasure as they tasted. It was a good feeling, she thought, to provide not just sustenance but also occasional delight, to remember that food could be more than fuel, that it could lift spirits and provide moments of simple happiness. The pies were not elaborate or fancy, but they were made with care and attention, and that made them special in their own way. That evening, after the cleaning was done and the kitchen was restored to order, Alice sat for a few moments at the table with a cup of warm ale, simply resting before climbing the stairs to her room. Margaret had gone, and the kitchen boys, and she was alone in the space that was so thoroughly her domain. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting gentle shadows across the walls. The herbs hanging from the rafters swayed slightly in some air current she could not feel. The pots gleamed dully in the firelight, clean and ready for tomorrow's use. Everything was as it should be, peaceful and prepared. Alice thought about the passage of time, about how days became weeks and weeks became seasons, about how she had lived so many years in this kitchen, rising before dawn and working until evening fell, feeding the household through countless meals. It was a life that might seem small or repetitive to some, she supposed, but to her it felt substantial and meaningful, filled with purpose and the satisfaction of work done well. She finished her ale and rose, banking the fire one more time, checking that all was secure. Then she climbed the stairs, the candle flame wavering slightly with her movement, casting moving shadows on the stone walls. In her room, she prepared for bed with the efficiency of a long habit, and when she settled under the blankets, she felt the day's work settling into her body as sleep. Her last thought before drifting off was of tomorrow's bread, of how she would shape it, and what else the day might require. And then even that thought faded into the quiet darkness of rest. The week unfolded in its steady progression, each day bringing variations on familiar themes. Some mornings the sky was gray with clouds that promised snow, and Alice would plan meals that could cook slowly without constant attention, freeing her to tend the fire more carefully against the drafts that found their way through the old stone walls. Other mornings dawned clear and cold, the sun bright but offering little warmth, and those days she would open the kitchen shutters briefly to let in fresh air that smelled of winter and wood smoke. One such clear morning, Alice decided to make a fish stew. A fisherman from the village had brought his catch to the castle the previous afternoon, and the fish had been kept cool overnight in the storage room where the winter air itself provided refrigeration. They were freshwater fish, caught from the river that ran through the valley below, pike and perch, their scales still bright, their flesh firm. She set Margaret to cleaning them, showing her how to scale them with the back of a knife, working from tail to head so the scales came away cleanly. The girl managed the task well, though she wrinkled her nose at first at the smell of raw fish. Alice smiled, remembering her own initial reluctance with certain tasks, and how time and repetition had made them simply part of the work, no longer strange or unpleasant but merely necessary. The cleaned fish were cut into pieces, and Alice began to build the stew's foundation. In a pot, she heated a small amount of the rendered fat from the beef roast, and into this she placed onions cut into thick slices. They cooked slowly, softening and becoming translucent, and she stirred them occasionally while preparing the other ingredients. Leeks came next, their white and pale green layers sliced into rounds, and these joined the onions in the pot. Alice added water, not too much, just enough to create a broth, and to this she added bay leaves and peppercorns and a generous amount of parsley from the dried bundles. The liquid began to heat, and the kitchen filled with the clean, savory smell of the developing broth. When the broth had simmered for a time, extracting flavor from the vegetables and herbs, Alice added the fish pieces carefully, laying them in the liquid so they would poach gently rather than boil. Fish required a delicate touch. She knew too much heat and it would become tough and dry, but the right temperature would keep it tender and flaky. While the fish cooked, she prepared bread trenchers, slicing day-old bread into thick pieces that would be placed in bowls to soak up the stew's broth. Trenchers served a double purpose, acting as both plate and food, and by the time the stew was eaten, they would have absorbed enough flavor to be delicious themselves. Thomas appeared with news that more travelers had arrived seeking shelter, a merchant and his 2 servants, making their way to the market town several days' journey to the north. Alice nodded, calculating quickly how much the additional mouths would require. The fish stew would stretch easily enough, and there was bread aplenty, and she could add more vegetables to the pot if needed. She sent Peter to the storage room to fetch more leeks and a turnip, and these were added to the pot, increasing its volume while also adding more flavor and substance. The fish was nearly done now, the flesh turning opaque and beginning to flake when she tested it gently with a spoon. She removed the pot from direct heat, letting it sit in the warmth of the hearth where it would stay hot without overcooking the delicate fish. The morning continued with its various tasks. Margaret had moved on to preparing a porridge of barley and dried fruit for the midday meal, something simple that would complement the fish stew for those who wanted it. Alice checked the bread supplies and decided they were adequate for now, but she mixed dough for tomorrow's baking, setting it in a cool corner of the kitchen to rise slowly overnight. She found herself thinking, as she worked, about the way the kitchen served as a kind of anchor for the castle's daily life. People came and went from here, servants collecting meals to carry to various parts of the castle, visitors warming themselves by the fire before continuing their journey, children sneaking and hopping for scraps or treats. The kitchen was constantly in motion, yet somehow also constant, always present and functional regardless of what else might be happening in the wider world beyond the castle walls. The merchant and his servants appeared at the midday meal, and Alice observed them with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to reading strangers. The merchant was a prosperous-looking man, well-dressed in wool and fur, his face reddened by the cold but his expression pleasant. His servants were younger, quieter, but they nodded their thanks when served, which Alice appreciated. Courtesy cost nothing and meant much in her estimation. The fish stew was well received, she noted with satisfaction. The trenchers soaked up the savory broth as intended, and people ate with obvious appetite, taking additional bread when it was offered. The merchant complimented the meal, and Alice accepted his words with a simple nod, neither dismissing the praise nor dwelling on it, simply acknowledging that the work had been done well. After the meal, when the kitchen had been restored to order and the afternoon stretched ahead, Alice took time to check the various crocks and containers that held the kitchen's dry goods. She did this regularly, maintaining an inventory in her mind of what was plentiful and what was running low, what would need to be requested from the castle steward or purchased at the next market day. The flour was adequate, she found, the large barrel still more than half full. The oats for porridge were sufficient. The dried peas and beans were plentiful. They had laid in a good supply the previous autumn. Salt was running lower than she liked, and she made a mental note to speak with the steward about obtaining more. The honey was adequate but would need replenishing before spring. The precious spices, cinnamon, pepper, cloves, were used so sparingly that they would last well into the next year. This kind of accounting was part of the work that others might not see or think about, but it was essential to keeping the kitchen running smoothly. Knowing what you had meant you could plan accordingly, could make decisions about meals based on reality rather than assumption, could avoid the crisis of discovering too late that some essential ingredient had run out. Margaret found her doing this inventory and asked if she could help, and Alice welcomed the offer, using it as an opportunity to teach the girl about organization and planning. She showed her how to check flour for weevils, how to smell grain to determine if it was still fresh or beginning to go musty, how to feel salt to make sure it had not absorbed too much moisture and began to clump. A good kitchen keeper knows her stores as well as she knows her own hands, Alice said, and Margaret nodded seriously, understanding that this was wisdom being offered, knowledge that went beyond the simple mechanics of cooking. They worked together companionably, checking and counting, making notes on a slate that Alice kept for this purpose. When they finished, Alice felt satisfied that all was in order, that she had a clear understanding of what the kitchen held and what it would need in the weeks ahead. The afternoon moved toward evening, and Alice began preparations for the next meal. There was a ham in the larder, smoked and cured, and she decided to bake it with honey and herbs, a dish that would provide substantial portions and would be especially welcome to the travelers who had come in from the cold. She scored the ham's surface in a diamond pattern, rubbed it with a mixture of honey and mustard and dried rosemary, and placed it in a pan to bake slowly in the oven. The honey would caramelize and form a glaze, and the meat would heat through and become tender, its smokiness balanced by the sweetness of the honey. While the ham baked, filling the kitchen with its rich aroma, Alice prepared turnips and parsnips to roast alongside it. These root vegetables were plentiful in the stores, and roasting brought out their natural sweetness, making them more appealing than simple boiling wood. She cut them into chunks, tossed them with a small amount of fat and salt, and arranged them in a pan that went into the oven alongside the ham. Thomas kept watch on both dishes, checking them regularly, and Alice was pleased to see him taking initiative in turning the vegetables so they would brown evenly. The boy was learning to anticipate rather than simply react, to see what needed doing and do it without being told. This was the mark of a good kitchen worker, she thought. Not just the ability to follow directions, but the understanding of why things were done, and the judgment to act accordingly. The evening meal, when it came, was hearty and satisfying. The ham was tender and flavorful, its glaze glistening in the candlelight of the great hall. The roasted vegetables were sweet and caramelized at their edges. There was fresh bread, butter, and ale drawn from the castle's stores. It was the kind of meal that made people linger at the table, that prompted conversation and laughter, that created a sense of warmth and fellowship that went beyond the simple satisfaction of hunger. Alice ate her own portion in the kitchen, as she usually did, preferring the quiet of her own space to the bustle of the hall. She sat at the long table with Margaret and the kitchen boys, and they shared the meal in comfortable silence, all of them tired but content with the day's accomplishments. Later, after the cleaning was done and the kitchen was settling into its nighttime quiet, Alice stepped outside briefly into the courtyard. The cold air was sharp against her face, and she could see her breath in small clouds. Above, the sky was clear and filled with stars, more stars than she could count, scattered across the darkness like salt spilled on a dark cloth. She stood there for only a moment, feeling the cold begin to penetrate her shawl, but it was enough to remember that there was a world beyond the kitchen walls, vast and unknowable, enough to feel small in a way that was somehow comforting rather than frightening. And then she went back inside, back to the warmth and the familiar smells and the work that awaited her tomorrow. She climbed the stairs to her room, carrying her candle, and prepared for sleep with the same practiced efficiency she brought to all her tasks. Under the blankets, she felt the day settling into her bones, the accumulation of hours spent standing and stirring and lifting and carrying. But it was a good tiredness, earned through useful work, and she welcomed it as she welcomed the darkness and the quiet that would allow her body to rest and restore itself for whatever tomorrow would bring. The following days brought a subtle shift in the weather. The cold remained as it would for weeks yet, but the sky took on a different quality, the clouds higher and thinner, allowing more light to filter through even when the sun itself was hidden. Alice noticed these changes the way she noticed everything in her domain, not with conscious attention, but with an awareness that lived somewhere deeper, in the part of her that had learned to read seasons, and weather as naturally as reading the doneness of bread or the readiness of rising dough. One morning she woke to find that snow had fallen during the night, not heavily, but enough to blanket the courtyard and muffle the usual sounds of the castle waking. The kitchen, when she descended to it, felt even more like a refuge than usual, its warmth and light a clear contrast to the white stillness outside. She built the fire as always, watching the flames catch and spread, and then stood for a moment at the window, looking out at the transformed landscape. The snow made everything simpler somehow, reducing the world to basic shapes and soft edges. It was beautiful in its way, she thought, this quiet blanketing of the familiar. The day's work would be much the same despite the snow. People still needed to eat, bread still needed to be baked, fires still needed tending. But there was something about the snow that made the kitchen feel even more essential, more clearly a place of warmth and sustenance against the cold world beyond. She began the morning's porridge, using oats and adding dried cherries that she had been saving, tiny bursts of sweetness that would make the plain grain more interesting. The cherries had been preserved in honey the previous summer, and they still held their flavor well, a small taste of warmer days in the depths of winter. Margaret arrived with snow dusting her shawl, her cheeks pink from the cold, and she went immediately to warm her hands by the fire before beginning her work. Alice poured her a cup of warm ale, and the girl accepted it gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around the cup and breathing in the steam. "It's beautiful out," Margaret said after a moment, "but I'm glad to be in here where it's warm." Alice nodded her agreement. She had lived through enough winters to appreciate beauty without romanticizing discomfort. Snow was lovely to look at, yes, but it also meant cold feet and numb fingers, more wood needed for fires, more care required to keep pathways clear and safe. The porridge thickened over the fire and Alice stirred it, adding the cherries near the end so they would warm through but not cook down completely. When she tasted it, she found the balance pleasing. The oats creamy and substantial, the cherries providing little pockets of concentrated sweetness, the whole thing warming and comforting. Thomas and Peter arrived together, both boys covered in snow from helping to clear the courtyard pathways. They shed their wet outer layers by the door and came to warm themselves by the fire, and Alice ladled them each a bowl of porridge before they began their tasks. Hot food for cold workers was simply practical. She believed people worked better when they were warm and fed. The morning routine proceeded. and Alice found herself making small adjustments for the snowy day. She had the kitchen boys bring in extra wood, stacking it near the hearth to dry. She checked that the water barrels were full, knowing that drawing water from the well would be more difficult with snow and ice making footing treacherous. She made sure there were plenty of clothes for drying wet hands and feet, knowing people would be coming in and out more frequently, seeking warmth. For the midday meal, she decided on a thick cabbage soup, something that could simmer for hours and would be ready whenever people needed it. She began with bacon, cutting it into small pieces and cooking it slowly in the bottom of a large pot until it released its fat and became crispy. The smell of the cooking bacon filled the kitchen, and Alice saw both boys glance hopefully in that direction. She removed most of the bacon pieces, setting them aside to add back later, and into the remaining fat she placed chopped onions and garlic. These cooked slowly, softening and taking on the bacon's flavor, and when they were ready, she added shredded cabbage, several handfuls of the hardy green leaves that stored so well through winter. The cabbage wilted and reduced in the pot, and Alice added water and a generous amount of pepper and some of the dried thyme. The soup would simmer for hours, the cabbage becoming tender, the flavors melding together. Near the end, she would add back the reserved bacon pieces and perhaps some barley to make it more substantial. While the soup was cooking, Alice turned her attention to bread. She had dough that had been rising overnight, and now she shaped it into loaves with her usual care, her hands moving through the familiar motions while her mind wandered peacefully. She thought about nothing in particular and everything at once. The snow outside, the warmth of the kitchen, the way Margaret was improving in her work, the fact that they would need more firewood delivered soon, the memory of another snowy day years ago when she had first learned to make this very cabbage soup from Joan. The bread went into the oven, and Alice settled onto her stool near the fire to rest for a few minutes. Her feet were tired already, though the day was not yet half done, and she allowed herself this brief respite, knowing that the afternoon would bring its own demands. Margaret was kneading dough at the long table, preparing it for tomorrow's baking, and the girl worked with steady rhythm, pressing and folding, pressing and folding. Alice watched her with approval, seeing how the girl had absorbed the lessons about not overworking the dough, about feeling for the right texture rather than simply following a set number of turns or folds. "You're doing that well," Alice said, and Margaret smiled without pausing in her work. "It's starting to feel natural," the girl replied. "Like my hands know what to do without me having to think about it so much." Alice nodded. "That's exactly right. The best learning happens in the hands and the body, not just in the mind. You're becoming a proper kitchen worker." The praise seemed to please Margaret, and she continued her kneading with perhaps a bit more confidence, a bit more ease. Alice felt satisfaction in this, not just that the girl was learning, but that she herself was able to teach, to pass on knowledge that had been given to her and would continue beyond her own time in this kitchen. The day progressed in its snowy quietness. The castle felt more contained somehow, more turned in upon itself, with fewer people venturing out unnecessarily. This meant the kitchen was busier than usual with people seeking warmth and hot food, and Alice managed the increased traffic with practiced efficiency, making sure there was always something ready to offer: warm soup, fresh bread, hot ale. The merchant who had arrived the previous day appeared to ask if he and his servants might extend their stay another night, as the roads would be difficult with the new snow. Alice had no say in such decisions, of course. That was the steward's domain. But she nodded when informed, already calculating what additional food would be needed. She decided to roast chicken for the evening meal. There were several birds in the larder, and they would provide good portions for the larger household. She prepared them with her usual care, rubbing them with butter and herbs, placing them in pans where they would roast slowly and evenly. While the chickens cooked, she made a sauce with wine and mushrooms that had been dried the previous autumn. The mushrooms needed to be soaked first to rehydrate them, and then they were cut and added to a pan with a small amount of butter and the wine. The sauce simmered and reduced, becoming concentrated and flavorful, something that would complement the simple roasted chicken beautifully. Thomas helped her turn the birds as they cooked, and Alice showed him how to test for doneness by piercing the thigh with a knife and checking that the juices ran clear rather than pink. These were skills that seemed small but mattered enormously. The difference between properly cooked food and food that was either underdone or dried out from too much time in the oven. The cabbage soup had been cooking for hours now, and Alice added back the bacon pieces she had reserved, along with a generous amount of barley. The soup had become rich and substantial, the cabbage completely tender, and the addition of the bacon and grain would make it even more satisfying. She tasted it, adjusted the seasoning one final time, and declared it ready. The evening meal was served in the great hall, and Alice supervised the carrying of platters and bowls, making sure everything arrived hot and properly arranged. The roasted chickens were golden and fragrant, the sauce glossy and dark. The soup was steamed in its serving bowls. There was bread and butter and ale, and afterward there would be the last of the small apple pies from earlier in the week, which had been kept wrapped and would be warmed slightly before serving. She ate her own meal in the kitchen, as always, finding comfort in the familiar space and the company of Margaret and the boys. They were all tired. It had been a busy day with the additional people seeking food and warmth. But there was satisfaction in the tiredness, the knowledge that they had managed well despite the increased demands. After the meal, after the cleaning was done and the kitchen was restored to its nighttime order, Alice stood once more at the window, looking out at the snow-covered courtyard. The snow glowed faintly in the darkness, reflecting what little light came from the castle's windows, and everything was utterly still and quiet. She thought about how the world continued through all its changes, seasons turning, snow falling and melting, years passing one into another. And through it all, there was the steady work of daily life, the continuous necessity of feeding and warming and caring for people. It was work that never ended, that would continue long after she herself was gone, carried on by others who would learn as she had learned, who would find the same satisfaction in doing the work well. She turned from the window and climbed the stairs to her room, carrying her candle, feeling the day settling into her bones as sleep. In her bed, under her warm blankets, she let her eyes close and her breathing slow, letting the tiredness carry her down into rest. Outside, the snow continued to blanket the world in its quiet whiteness. But inside, in her small room above the kitchen, Alice slept peacefully, her work complete for another day. The snow remained for several days, gradually compacting under its own weight and the traffic of feet crossing the courtyard. Each morning brought a fresh dusting that covered the previous day's marks, and each day the kitchen continued its steady work, providing warmth and sustenance to a household that had drawn in upon itself against the winter cold. Alice found a particular rhythm in these snowy days, a rhythm that felt even more deliberate and measured than usual. The world outside moved slowly when blanketed in snow, and the kitchen seemed to match that pace, its work no less thorough but somehow more contemplative, more aware of each small action and its purpose. One morning she decided to bake pasties, small hand pies filled with meat and vegetables that could be eaten without utensils, convenient for people who needed to take their food with them as they worked. She made the pastry dough first, working the cold butter into the flour until the mixture resembled coarse meal, then adding just enough cold water to bring it together into a smooth dough. The dough needed to rest, to allow the gluten to relax and make it easier to roll, so she wrapped it in a cloth and set it aside while she prepared the filling. The filling was made from leftover roasted chicken, pulled from the bones and cut into small pieces. To this, she added onions that had been cooked until soft, carrots diced fine, and a handful of peas from the dried stores that had been soaked until tender. She seasoned the mixture with salt and pepper and a small amount of the savory herbs, mixing everything together until it was well combined. Margaret watched the process with interest, and Alice talked her through each step, explaining why the pastry needed to be kept cold, why the filling should not be too wet or it would make the pastry soggy, why the edges needed to be sealed carefully to prevent leaking during baking. The girl listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that showed she was thinking about the underlying principles rather than just memorizing steps. When the dough had rested sufficiently, Alice rolled it out on the floured table, working quickly to keep it from warming too much. She cut circles using a bowl as a guide and showed Margaret how to place a spoonful of filling on one half of each circle, leaving a border of clean dough around the edge. Then the pastry was folded over, enclosing the filling, and the edges were pressed together and crimped to seal them. Margaret tried her hand at making several, and though her crimping was less even than Alice's, she managed to create pasties that were properly sealed and reasonably attractive. Alice praised the girl's work, and Margaret beamed with pleasure, clearly proud of what she had accomplished. The pasties went into the oven, arranged on baking sheets, and Alice watched them carefully as they cooked. The pastry needed to become golden and crisp, and the filling needed to heat through completely. The smell that began to fill the kitchen was wonderful, butter and meat and herbs combining into something hearty and appealing. While the pasties baked, Alice prepared a simple soup of leeks and potatoes, vegetables that were plentiful in the stores and that made a soothing, creamy soup when cooked together. She cut the leeks carefully, making sure to wash away any soil that clung between their layers, and she peeled the potatoes, cutting them into pieces that would cook evenly. The vegetables went into a pot with water and a good amount of butter, and Alice set them to simmer gently until they were completely tender. When they reached this point, She used a wooden spoon to mash some of the potatoes against the side of the pot, thickening the soup and giving it a creamy texture without needing to add cream itself, which was a luxury they used sparingly in winter. Thomas came to report that several of the men-at-arms were preparing to ride out to check on the outlying farms, to make sure the tenants were managing well with the snow and had sufficient supplies. Alice nodded and set aside several of the pasties as soon as they came from the oven, wrapping them in cloth while they were still warm. The men could take them and eat as they rode, and the food would help keep them warm from the inside against the cold journey. The pastries that remained were arranged on platters for the midday meal, and Alice cut one open to check that the filling was properly cooked and hot throughout. Steam rose from the opening, carrying the savory smell of chicken and vegetables, and when she tasted a small piece, she found it satisfying. The pastry flaky and buttery, the filling well seasoned and substantial. The meal was served, and as always, Alice paid attention to how the food was received. She noticed that the pasties disappeared quickly, that people seemed to appreciate their convenience and flavor, and she filed this observation away for future reference. Good dishes that were also practical were worth remembering and repeating. The afternoon brought a lull in the kitchen's activity, a brief space of quiet between meals, and Alice used this time to attend to some of the smaller, ongoing tasks that could easily be neglected in the press of cooking. She sharpened knives that had grown dull with use, drawing each blade across the whetstone with steady, even strokes until the edge was keen again. Sharp knives were safer than dull ones. She had learned long ago. They required less force and gave more control, reducing the chance of slips that could lead to cuts. She checked the stores of dried beans and peas, making sure they remained dry and free of pests. She examined the hanging herbs, removing any that had lost too much potency and making notes about what would need to be gathered fresh when spring finally came. She wiped down shelves and reorganized containers, maintaining the order that made the kitchen function efficiently. Margaret helped with these tasks, and they worked together in companionable quiet, the kind of shared silence that came from comfort with each other's presence. Occasionally, one of them would comment on something, a jar that needed washing, a shelf that could be rearranging, but mostly they simply worked, each attending to what they saw needed doing. As the light began to fade and the day moved toward evening, Alice started preparations for the next meal. She had a large piece of salted pork that needed to be cooked, and she decided to boil it with root vegetables and herbs, creating a simple but hearty dish that would feed the household well. The pork went into a large pot of water, and she added onions, carrots, turnips, and parsnips, all cut into substantial pieces. To this, she added bay leaves and peppercorns, and she set the pot over a moderate fire where it would simmer gently for several hours. The salt from the pork would season the vegetables as they cooked, and the vegetables would release their sweetness into the broth, creating something that was greater than the sum of its parts. While the pork simmered, Alice made bread to accompany it, working through the familiar process of kneading and shaping with the ease of countless repetitions. Her hands moved almost independently of conscious thought, and she found herself thinking about the passage of time, about how many loaves of bread she had made in this kitchen, about how the work that seemed so routine was actually quite remarkable in its consistency and reliability. The bread went into the oven, and Alice returned to check the pork, testing its tenderness with a fork. It was not quite ready yet, still slightly resistant, so she let it continue cooking while she prepared the table for serving, setting out platters and bowls and making sure the knives for carving were sharp and ready. By the time the bells rang for evening prayers, the pork was perfectly tender, and the vegetables had absorbed the meat's flavor while contributing their own subtle sweetness. Alice removed the meat from the pot and let it rest briefly before carving it into thick slices. The vegetables were lifted out with a slotted spoon and arranged around the meat on large platters. The meal was carried to the great hall, and Alice followed to supervise, making sure everything was arranged properly on the tables. The merchant and his servants were still there. The roads remained difficult for travel, and she saw them settle into the meal with obvious appreciation. The travelers had that particular kind of hunger that came from being on the road in winter, and good hot food meant more to them than it might to people who had been warm and settled all day. She returned to the kitchen and served portions for herself and Margaret and the boys, and they ate together at their table, all of them tired from the day's work but satisfied with what had been accomplished. The pork was tender and savory, the vegetables were sweet and soft, and the bread was perfect for soaking up the flavorful broth that remained in the bowls. After the meal, after the cleaning was complete and the kitchen had been restored to order once again, Alice found herself standing at the window as she often did in these evening moments, looking out at the snow-covered courtyard. The snow was beginning to show signs of age now, no longer pristine white but marked and compacted, showing the patterns of daily traffic. She thought about how snow, like everything else, changed over time. It fell fresh and perfect, then it was walked upon and disturbed, then gradually it melted away, returning to water and eventually to vapor, only to fall again in some future storm. There was something in this cycle that felt relevant to her own work, to the way meals were prepared and eaten and then prepared again, to the way bread was baked and consumed and then baked anew, an endless cycle of creation and completion and new creation. Margaret appeared beside her at the window, and they stood together for a moment in silence, both looking out at the quiet evening. "Do you ever grow tired of it?" Margaret asked after a while. "The same work day after day?" Alice considered the question carefully before answering. "Sometimes," she said honestly. "Sometimes my feet ache and I think how nice it would be to spend a day doing nothing. But mostly no. Mostly I find satisfaction in it. The work needs doing and doing it well matters. People depend on it and that makes it worthwhile." Margaret nodded slowly, absorbing this. "I think I understand," she said. "It's not exciting perhaps, but it's important." "Yes," Alice agreed. "Exactly that. Not everything important is exciting. Some of the most important things are steady and reliable and repeated day after day." They stood a moment longer, and then Alice stirred herself, remembering that there were still a few tasks to complete before she could climb the stairs to her rest. She banked the fire, checked that all was secure, and made her final survey of the kitchen to ensure nothing had been forgotten. Then, as she had done countless times before, She took up her candle and climbed the narrow stairs to her small room. She prepared for bed in the darkness that the single candle barely pushed back, and when she settled under the blankets, she felt the day's work settling into her body, becoming part of the accumulated experience of all the days that had come before. Outside, the snow held its quiet vigil over the sleeping castle. Inside, Alice drifted into sleep, her breathing slow and even her rest well-earned. Tomorrow would bring more work, more meals to prepare, more tasks to complete. But that was tomorrow. For now, there was only the darkness and the warmth and the piece of work completed and rest deserved. The snow began to thin in the days that followed, not melting dramatically but gradually diminishing, revealing patches of brown earth in the courtyard and along the edges of pathways where the sun reached most directly. The change was subtle, measured in small increments rather than sudden transformation, and Alice marked it the way she marked all seasonal shifts, with quiet observation and adjustments to her work. The merchant and his servants departed on a morning when the sky was clear and the roads had been judged passable. Alice sent them off with bread and cheese wrapped in cloth, provisions for their journey, and they thanked her warmly before mounting their horses and riding out through the castle gates. The kitchen felt quieter after their departure, returning to its more usual rhythms and numbers. One morning, Alice decided to make a dish she had not prepared in some time, a savory pudding of bread and herbs and eggs, baked until golden and served in thick slices. It was a dish that made good use of bread that had grown too stale for the table but was still perfectly good for cooking, and it had the virtue of being both economical and satisfying. She tore the stale bread into pieces and placed them in a large bowl, then poured warm milk over them to soften. While the bread soaked, she chopped onions fine and cooked them slowly in butter until they were completely soft and beginning to turn golden at the edges. To these, she added fresh sage leaves, or as fresh as could be had in winter, from the plant that grew in a pot on the kitchen windowsill, protected from the frost and coaxed into producing a few leaves despite the season. The sage leaves were torn rather than cut, and their scent filled the kitchen as they were stirred into the softened onions. Alice breathed in the aroma with appreciation. Sage had such a distinctive smell, earthy and slightly sharp, unmistakable, and somehow comforting in its familiarity. When the onions and sage were ready, she added them to the bowl with the soaked bread, along with several eggs beaten until they were frothy and well combined. She mixed everything together with her hands, feeling the texture of the mixture, judging by touch whether it needed more milk or perhaps another egg to achieve the right consistency. Moist but not wet, cohesive but not dense. The mixture went into a buttered baking dish, and she smoothed the top with a wooden spoon, then set it in the oven to bake slowly. The pudding would need time to cook through and develop its golden crust, and she would check it periodically, testing its firmness with a gentle press of her finger. While the pudding baked, Alice turned her attention to other tasks. There was always something that needed doing: vegetables to prepare for later meals, pots to scrub, linens to check for wear. She moved through these tasks with her usual thoroughness, her mind both focused on the work and also wandering peacefully through thoughts that had no particular direction or urgency. Margaret was working at the table, grinding spices with a mortar and pestle. The task required patience and steady effort, crushing the dried peppercorns and coriander seeds into powder that could be used more easily in cooking. The girl worked steadily, and Alice could hear the rhythmic sound of the pestle against the mortar, a sound that had been part of kitchens for longer than anyone could remember. Thomas appeared with word that the castle's lord had invited several neighboring landowners to dine the following week, and that the meal should be particularly fine, as he hoped to discuss matters of mutual interest with them. Alice received this information with a nod, already beginning to plan in her mind what such a meal should include. It would need to demonstrate the castle's hospitality and prosperity without appearing ostentatious, would need to be impressive but not overly elaborate. She would have time to prepare properly, which was good. A fine meal could not be rushed, required planning and careful timing and attention to detail. She thought through what the stores held, what fresh provisions might need to be requested, what dishes would work well together to create a satisfying progression through the meal. But that was for tomorrow's planning. Today there was still the immediate work at hand. She checked the savory pudding and found it nearly done, the top golden brown and slightly puffed, the interior firm when she tested it with a knife. She removed it from the oven and let it rest while she prepared the accompaniments: slices of cold ham from the larder, bread and butter, a small salad of preserved vegetables from the stores. The midday meal was simple but good, the pudding providing substance and the ham adding saltiness that balanced the pudding's richness. Alice served portions to the household, and she noticed that people seemed pleased with the dish, many taking second helpings when offered. She ate her own meal thoughtfully, tasting not just with her mouth but with her mind, evaluating the pudding's texture and flavor, considering whether she might adjust the proportions slightly the next time she made it. Perhaps a bit more sage, she thought, or possibly a handful of dried currants for sweetness. These were the small refinements that came from repeated making, from paying attention to results and being willing to make small changes. The afternoon brought a visitor to the kitchen, Father Benedict, the castle chaplain, who appeared in the doorway with a somewhat apologetic expression. He was a gentle man, scholarly and kind, and Alice had always found him pleasant to work with. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, "but I wondered if you might have a bit of honey to spare. I'm making a copy of a psalter for the chapel, and I need honey to mix with the egg yolk for gilding the initial letters." Alice nodded and went to fetch the honey crock, ladling a generous amount into a small jar for him. "Will this be sufficient?" she asked. "More than sufficient," Father Benedict said gratefully. "Thank you, Alice. Your generosity is appreciated." "It's no trouble," she replied. "How does the copying progress?" "Slowly but steadily," the priest said with a small smile. "Much like all worthwhile work, I suppose. One letter at a time, one word at a time, and eventually a page is complete." Alice found herself nodding in recognition. "Yes," she said, "that's very much how it is in the kitchen as well. One task at a time, and eventually the meal is ready." They spoke for a few moments more, and then Father Benedict departed with his honey, and Alice returned to her work. But his words stayed with her, the idea that all worthwhile work proceeded in this same manner, through steady attention to small steps, through patience and persistence rather than dramatic gestures. She began preparations for the evening meal, which would be a simple pottage of dried beans that had been soaking since morning. The beans went into a pot with water and onions and carrots, and she set them to cook slowly, knowing they would need several hours to become properly tender. While the beans cooked, she made pastry for small tarts that would provide something sweet at the meal's end. The pastry was rolled thin and cut into circles that lined small tart tins, and into these, she spooned a mixture of dried apples cooked down with honey and spices until they formed a thick, sweet filling. Margaret helped with this work, and Alice watched approvingly as the girl handled the delicate pastry with care, learning through practice how much pressure to use, how to work quickly enough that the pastry stayed cold, but not so quickly that mistakes were made. The tarts went into the oven, and their baking filled the kitchen with the warm scent of cinnamon and apples and butter. It was a homely smell, comforting and familiar, and Alice found herself thinking about how certain smells could evoke such strong associations, how the scent of baking apples would always remind her of autumn harvests and preparations for winter, how bread baking would always mean morning and new beginnings, how roasting meat would always suggest celebration and plenty. The beans were tender now, their cooking liquid thickened by the starch they had released. Alice seasoned the pottage carefully, tasting and adjusting until the flavors were balanced and right. She added a small amount of the bacon fat she kept stored for such purposes, which enriched the beans and gave them additional depth. The evening meal came together in its proper time. The bean pottage ladled into bowls, bread sliced and arranged on platters, the small apple tarts still warm from the oven. It was a satisfying meal, substantial without being heavy, simple but well prepared. After the household had eaten and the kitchen had been cleaned and set right for the night, Alice found herself with a rare moment of true leisure. The day's work was complete, tomorrow's preparations could wait, and she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of ale, simply resting. Margaret had gone to her own rest, and the kitchen boys had departed, and Alice was alone in the space that was so thoroughly her own. The fire burned low in the hearth, providing warmth without excessive light, and the kitchen was filled with that particular quality of quiet that came in the evening hours, when work was done and the world was settling toward sleep. She thought about the day that had passed, about the savory pudding and the apple tarts, about Father Benedict and his psalter, about the merchant who had departed and the dinner that would need to be planned. She thought about Margaret's growing skill and Thomas's increasing reliability, and the way the seasons moved forward in their ancient pattern, bringing change that was somehow also constant. There was satisfaction in this work, she thought again. Satisfaction in doing something necessary and doing it well, in being part of a household's life in this essential way, in feeding people not just to prevent hunger, but to provide comfort and nourishment and moments of simple pleasure. She finished her ale and rose, banking the fire one last time, checking that all was secure. Then she took up her candle and climbed the stairs, her feet finding the worn steps without conscious guidance, her body knowing the path through long repetition. In her room, she prepared for sleep with her usual efficiency, and when she lay down beneath her blankets, she felt the day's work settling into her bones, becoming part of the fabric of her life, part of the accumulated experience of all the days that had come before and all the days that would come after. Outside, the night was clear and cold, the stars bright in the darkness. The castle slept around her, its various inhabitants in their own beds, their bellies full of the food she had prepared, their bodies warmed by the work she had overseen. It was a good feeling, she thought as sleep began to claim her, to know that her work mattered, that it contributed to the well-being of the community in which she lived. And then she was sleeping, her breathing slow and deep, her rest peaceful and complete, while the night continued its patient journey toward morning, when she would wake and begin again, as she had done for so many years and would continue to do for as many more as she was given. The morning that followed brought with it the first true hint of approaching spring, though winter was far from finished. The air, when Alice stepped briefly into the courtyard to draw water, held a different quality. Still cold, certainly, but somehow less harsh, less biting. The snow that remained had compacted into patches of ice along the shadowed walls, but elsewhere the ground was visible, dark and wet but free of white. She carried the water bucket back to the kitchen and set about the morning's work with her customary steadiness. The fire came to life under her hands. The porridge began its slow thickening over the heat, and the kitchen gradually transformed from the cold quiet of night into the warm activity of day. Today she would begin planning in earnest for the dinner that the Lord had requested, the meal that would need to demonstrate hospitality and skill without appearing to try too hard. She had been thinking about it in the back of her mind since receiving word of it, and now she brought those thoughts to the forefront, considering them more deliberately. The meal would need to proceed through several courses, she decided. It should begin with something light and appealing to whet the appetite, perhaps a clear soup with herbs, or small pastries filled with cheese and greens. Then a fish course, as was customary for formal meals, and she would need to arrange for fresh fish to be brought from the river or perhaps even from the coast if weather and roads permitted. The main course should be substantial and impressive, a roasted joint of meat, perhaps venison if the Lord's hunters had been successful recently, or beef if not. This would be accompanied by several dishes of vegetables prepared in different ways, and by sauces that would complement the meat. Then a sweet course to finish, something that showed care and attention, perhaps a custard tart or preserved fruits arranged with honey and spices, or small cakes flavored with rosewater. She would need to speak with the castle steward about provisions, would need to ensure that everything necessary was either in the stores or could be obtained in time. She would need to plan the timing carefully, so that each course could be served at the proper temperature and in the proper sequence. She would need to make sure her kitchen staff understood their roles and could execute them without confusion or error. But all of that could be addressed in the days ahead. For now, there was still the immediate work of feeding the household through this ordinary day. The porridge was ready, and people began to arrive seeking breakfast, and Alice served each person with her usual attention, making sure portions were adequate and that everyone received what they needed. Margaret arrived and immediately set about slicing bread, and Alice was pleased to see that the girl no longer needed direction for these basic morning tasks. simply moved into them naturally as part of the kitchen's routine. This was progress, she thought, not the dramatic kind that was immediately visible, but the gradual kind that came from repetition and attention, from doing something often enough that it became second nature. After breakfast, Alice sat down with a slate and a piece of chalk to make notes about the formal dinner. She wrote out her thoughts about the menu, about what would be needed, about the timing of various preparations. The writing was laborious. She had learned letters late in life and never achieved the fluid ease that came to those taught young. But it served its purpose, giving her a way to organize her thoughts and create a reference she could return to. Margaret watched with interest as Alice worked, and when the cook had finished her initial notes, the girl asked if she might see what had been written. Alice passed her the slate, and Margaret studied it carefully. "This is very thorough," the girl said after a moment. "You've thought of everything." "I've tried to," Alice replied. "With a meal like this, it's better to plan too much than too little. If something goes wrong, I want to have already considered how to address it." She went through the menu with Margaret, explaining why she had chosen each dish, how they would work together, what challenges each one might present. The girl listened attentively, asking occasional questions that showed she was thinking about the underlying principles rather than just memorizing the specific menu. "Why start with something light rather than something substantial?" Margaret asked at one point. "Because if people fill themselves too quickly, they won't be able to appreciate the courses that follow," Alice explained. "A good meal should build gradually, should save the most impressive dishes for the middle of the sequence, and should end with something sweet but not too heavy, so people leave the table satisfied but not uncomfortable." Margaret nodded, understanding, and they continued their discussion until Alice felt confident the girl had grasped the overall plan and purpose. This was part of teaching too. She knew, not just showing someone how to perform tasks, but helping them understand the reasoning behind those tasks, so they could eventually make their own decisions rather than simply following directions. The rest of the day proceeded with its normal work, but Alice found herself thinking frequently about the upcoming dinner, mentally reviewing her plans, considering whether any adjustments might be needed. By evening, she had refined her menu somewhat and had a clear list of what would need to be obtained from outside the castle stores. The following morning, she sought out Robert the steward in his small office near the Great Hall. He looked up from the accounts he was reviewing and gestured for her to enter. "Alice," he said, "I assume this is about the dinner for the Lord's guests." "It is," she confirmed, and she went through her menu with him, explaining what she would need, what could be provided from current stores, and what would need to be purchased or otherwise obtained. Robert listened carefully, making notes of his own, and when she had finished, he nodded approval. "This seems well planned," he said. "I'll arrange for the fish to be brought from the market town. There's a fishmonger there who provides good quality. And I'll speak with the hunters about venison, though we may need to use beef if they haven't been successful. Everything else we should be able to manage from stores or from the castle's resources." "Thank you," Alice said. "If I might make one more request, I'd like to have an additional pair of hands in the kitchen that day, someone to help with the serving and the smaller tasks, so that Margaret and I can focus on the cooking itself." "I'll arrange it," Robert agreed. "I'll send one of the chambermaid's assistants, someone reliable who can follow directions." With these arrangements made, Alice returned to her kitchen feeling more confident about the dinner. The planning was progressing well. The necessary provisions would be obtained, and she would have adequate help when the day came. Now it was simply a matter of executing what had been planned, of bringing her vision into reality through careful work and attention to detail. The days between this planning and the actual dinner passed in their usual rhythm, but with an underlying current of preparation. Alice made pastry dough ahead and kept it wrapped in the cool storage room, ready to be rolled when needed. She prepared stocks and sauces that could be made in advance, concentrating flavors through long, slow cooking. She checked and rechecked her stores, making sure she had sufficient quantities of everything that would be needed. Margaret proved invaluable during this preparation, taking on more responsibility and managing it well. The girl made the initial batches of small pastries for the first course, and Alice checked her work and found it well executed. She prepared vegetables for later cooking, cutting them uniformly so they would cook evenly. She helped organize the kitchen so that everything would be readily at hand when the crucial day arrived. Thomas and Peter, seeing the preparations underway, asked if there was anything they could do to help, and Alice appreciated their initiative. She had them bring in extra wood and stack it carefully near the hearth, had them make sure all the serving platters and bowls were spotlessly clean, had them check that the tables in the great hall were in good condition and properly set up for the formal meal. 2 days before the dinner, the fish arrived, beautiful fresh pike and trout, their scales still bright, their flesh firm. Alice examined them with satisfaction and had them stored in the coldest part of the storage room, packed in straw to keep them fresh. The hunters had been successful as well, and a haunch of venison arrived, dark-fleshed and lean, perfect for roasting. The day before the dinner, Alice devoted entirely to preparation. She made the custard filling for tarts, cooking milk and eggs and honey together slowly until the mixture thickened and became silky. She prepared the venison for roasting, rubbing it with herbs and garlic, wrapping it in cloth so the seasonings would penetrate the meat overnight. She made more pastry, rolled out circles for the first course's small pies, prepared fillings of cheese and greens that would be spooned into them just before baking. By evening, when the initial preparations were complete, Alice felt tired but satisfied. Everything was progressing according to plan, and she felt confident that the dinner would be a success. She ate her own evening meal with Margaret, and they spoke about the next day's schedule, making sure they both understood exactly what would need to happen and when. "Are you nervous?" Margaret asked at one point. Alice considered the question. "Not nervous exactly," she said. "More alert, aware that everything must go right, that there's no room for carelessness or mistakes. But I've done this before and I know we're well prepared. If we work carefully and stay focused, it will be fine." Margaret nodded, seeming reassured by Alice's calm confidence, and they finished their meal in companionable quiet. That night, lying in her bed, Alice found her mind running through the next day's tasks, checking mentally that she hadn't forgotten anything, that all the pieces were in place. Eventually, she consciously set these thoughts aside, reminding herself that she had done everything she could to prepare, and that rest was essential if she was to work effectively tomorrow. She let her breathing slow, let her body relax into the mattress, and gradually sleep claimed her, deep and dreamless and restorative. The morning of the dinner arrived with a sky that promised fair weather, pale and clear, as Alice looked out from her window before descending to the kitchen. She had woken even earlier than usual, her body responding to the importance of the day ahead, and she moved through the cold pre-dawn darkness with purpose and calm determination. The fire came to life quickly under her practiced hands, and she built it higher than usual, knowing that the oven would need to be thoroughly heated for the various bakings the day would require. While the fire established itself, she went through a mental inventory of everything that needed to be accomplished, ordering the tasks in her mind according to their timing and interdependencies. The guests would arrive in the early afternoon and would be received by the Lord before being invited to dine in the early evening. This gave Alice and her staff the full day to prepare, but it also meant that timing would be crucial. Dishes needed to be ready in sequence. Nothing completed too early or too late, everything coming together at precisely the right moments. Margaret arrived shortly after Alice, her face showing both eagerness and nervousness. "I'm ready to help however you need," the girl said, and Alice smiled at her earnestness. "I know you are," Alice replied, "and you'll do well. Just remember to work carefully rather than quickly, and if you're uncertain about anything, ask rather than guessing." The chambermaid's assistant that Robert had promised also arrived, a young woman named Emma who Alice knew slightly from around the castle. Emma was quiet and competent, and Alice quickly assessed that she would be able to handle the tasks assigned to her without needing constant supervision. "Emma, you'll be responsible for keeping the serving platters clean and ready, for carrying dishes to the hall when they're needed, and for making sure we have sufficient clean linens throughout the preparation," Alice explained. "Margaret will show you where everything is kept." With her staff assembled and their roles clarified, Alice began the day's work in earnest. First came the small pastries for the opening course. The pastry circles that had been prepared yesterday now needed their filling and baking. Margaret and Emma worked together on this task under Alice's supervision, spooning the cheese and greens mixture into each pastry circle, folding them into half moons, sealing the edges carefully. While they worked on the pastries, Alice turned her attention to the fish course. The pike and trout needed to be cleaned and filleted, their bones removed with painstaking care so that the guests would not encounter any unpleasant surprises. She worked with her sharpest knife, feeling for bones with her fingertips, removing each one individually. The fillets, once prepared, were arranged in a baking dish and set aside, ready to be cooked later. Thomas appeared and was immediately put to work turning the spit where the venison would roast. Alice had him position it over the fire and showed him exactly how she wanted the haunch secured, how often it should be turned, what signs to watch for as it cooked. The boy listened with serious attention, understanding that he was being trusted with an important responsibility. The morning progressed in a flow of continuous activity. Alice moved between tasks with practiced efficiency, checking on multiple preparations simultaneously, adjusting timing as needed, tasting and evaluating at every stage. The kitchen filled with the mingled aromas of baking pastry, roasting meat, and the various sauces and dishes in preparation. The small pastries came from the oven golden and fragrant, and Alice examined them critically before nodding her approval. They would be kept warm but not hot, ready to serve when the guests first sat down. The custard tarts were assembled and went into the oven to bake slowly, their filling delicate and requiring careful attention to temperature. For the vegetables that would accompany the venison, Alice had planned several preparations. Turnips would be glazed with honey and butter. Carrots would be roasted with herbs until they were tender and caramelized, and cabbage would be braised with bacon and onions until it was silky and rich. Each dish required its own timing, its own attention, and Alice orchestrated them all with the assurance that came from years of experience. The clear soup for the first course was perhaps the most challenging element. It needed to be absolutely transparent, showing no cloudiness or imperfection. Alice had made the stock days before, straining it multiple times through progressively finer cloths until it was crystal clear. Now she warmed it gently, adding fresh herbs at the last possible moment so they would release their fragrance without making the soup murky. By early afternoon, the preparations were well advanced. The venison was roasting beautifully, its exterior developing a deep brown crust while the interior remained rosy and tender. The fish fillets were ready to be quickly poached in wine and butter. The vegetables were in various stages of cooking, each time to be ready at the proper moment. The custard tarts had baked to perfection and were cooling on their racks. Alice called her small staff together for a brief moment. "We're doing well," she told them. "Everything is on schedule. Now comes the most important part, the actual serving. Margaret, you'll help me with plating. Emma, you'll carry dishes to the hall as they're ready. Thomas, you'll continue with the venison until I tell you it's done. Then you'll help with whatever else is needed. Peter, you'll keep the fires at the right levels and make sure we have hot water available at all times." They all nodded their understanding, and Alice felt confident in their readiness. She had trained them well, had prepared thoroughly, and now it was simply a matter of executing what had been planned. Word came from the hall that the guests had arrived and were being received by the Lord. Alice used this information to refine her timing. They would likely sit down to dine within the hour, which meant the first course needed to be ready to serve shortly after that. She checked the soup one final time, tasted it, found it perfect, clear and aromatic, delicate but flavorful. The small pastries were warming gently near the fire. Everything for the first course was ready. When the call came that the guests were being seated, Alice felt the familiar heightening of focus that came at such moments. This was the culmination of days of preparation, and everything needed to proceed smoothly. She ladled the clear soup into shallow bowls, each one garnished with a single perfect sprig of fresh herbs. The bowls were arranged on a large tray, and Emma carried them carefully to the hall. The small pastries followed, arranged on platters, still warm and fragrant. Alice watched them go and then turned immediately to the next course. The fish needed to go into its poaching liquid now, needed exactly the right amount of time to cook through without becoming tough. The fish poached gently in its bath of wine and butter, and Alice monitored it closely, testing it with a fork to judge its doneness. When it was ready, tender and flacking easily but still moist, she carefully lifted the fillets from the liquid and arranged them on serving platters. The poaching liquid was strained and enriched with more butter, becoming a sauce that was spooned over the fish. Fresh bread accompanied the fish course, and Alice had made sure to have several loaves that were still warm from the oven, their crusts crackling, their interiors soft and aromatic. The fish platters and bread baskets were carried to the hall, and Emma returned with word that the first course had been very well received, that the Lord seemed pleased. Now came the main course, the culmination of the meal. Alice checked the venison and found it perfectly cooked, the interior rosy and juicy, the exterior richly browned. She had Thomas help her remove it from the spit and place it on a large wooden carving board to rest briefly before carving. While the venison rested, Alice completed the vegetable preparations. The glazed turnips were glossy and tender. The roasted carrots were caramelized and sweet. The braised cabbage was rich and savory. Each dish was arranged on its own platter, and Alice ensured that the presentations were attractive as well as appetizing. She carved the venison herself, her knife moving smoothly through the tender meat, creating slices that were neither too thick nor too thin, each one showing the rosy interior and the flavorful crust. The slices were arranged on a large platter, and the various vegetable dishes were assembled around it. The main course made an impressive display as it was carried to the hall, the venison commanding attention, the colorful vegetables providing variety and visual appeal, the sauces adding richness and depth. Alice watched it go with satisfaction, knowing that it represented her best work, executed under pressure and completed successfully. The custard tarts that would end the meal were ready, their filling set and creamy, their pastry golden and crisp. Alice arranged them on platters, garnishing each one with a small spoonful of preserved berries that added a bright note of color and a touch of tartness to balance the tart's sweetness. When word came that the main course had been cleared and the guests were ready for the sweet course, Alice had the tarts carried in, and with them went small cups of spiced wine that she had prepared, warm and fragrant with cinnamon and cloves. And then, quite suddenly, the intense period of activity was over. The meal had been served, all the courses delivered in their proper sequence, and now there was nothing to do but wait for word of how it had been received. Alice sat down on her stool, feeling the tension of the past hours beginning to ease from her shoulders, and accepted the cup of ale that Margaret brought her. The kitchen had achieved a state of controlled chaos. Dishes were stacked waiting to be washed. Pots needed scrubbing. The table was covered with the remnants of preparation. But all of that could wait for a moment. The important work was done. Robert the steward appeared in the doorway, and Alice looked up to meet his eyes. He was smiling, which was not something he did frequently. "The Lord asks that you know the meal was excellent," he said. "The guests have praised every course, and he is very pleased with the impression made. Well done, Alice." She nodded, accepting the compliment with quiet dignity. "Thank you. I'm glad it was satisfactory." "More than satisfactory," Robert assured her. "Truly exceptional. You've done the castle credit." After he left, Alice sat for a moment longer, feeling the satisfaction of work completed successfully, of a challenge met and overcome through careful planning and skilled execution. Then she rose and began organizing the cleaning. There was still much to be done before the day was truly finished, but the most demanding part was behind them. Margaret and Emma and the boys worked with good will, and the kitchen gradually returned to order. Dishes were washed and put away, surfaces were scrubbed clean, the fires were banked to their normal evening levels. By the time darkness had fully fallen, the kitchen showed almost no sign of the intensive work that had taken place within it. Alice served a simple evening meal for her staff, bread and cheese and cold meat, nothing elaborate after the complexity of the formal dinner. They ate together at the kitchen table, all of them tired but pleased with what they had accomplished. "That was remarkable to be part of," Margaret said after a while. "Seeing how everything came together, how you managed all the different elements." "You all did your parts well," Alice replied. "A meal like that cannot be accomplished by one person alone. It requires everyone working together, each person doing their task properly and at the right time. You should all be proud of today's work." They finished their meal, completed the final cleaning, and then dispersed to their own rest. Alice made her last check of the kitchen, ensuring all was secure for the night, and then climbed the stairs to her room with legs that ached from the long day of standing and moving. In her bed, she reflected on the day, the careful planning that had preceded it, the intense focus during execution, the satisfaction of success. Tomorrow the kitchen would return to its normal rhythms, but tonight she could rest knowing that when called upon to demonstrate her skill at the highest level, she had done so successfully. The castle slept around her, its lord and guests and household all fed and content, and Alice drifted into sleep with the deep tiredness that came from work well done, her rest earned through effort and attention, and the application of a lifetime's accumulated knowledge and skill. The morning after the formal dinner brought with it a return to the kitchen's familiar rhythms, though Alice woke with a body that reminded her of the previous day's exertions. Her shoulders were stiff, her feet tender, but these discomforts were temporary and expected, the natural consequence of work intensely done. She rose and dressed as always, and descended to the kitchen where the fire waited to be woken from its banked coals. The work that day felt easier somehow, lighter, as though the successful completion of the dinner had created a kind of buoyancy that carried through into the ordinary tasks. Alice made porridge for breakfast, sliced bread, arranged cheese on platters, and found satisfaction in the very simplicity of these preparations after yesterday's complexity. Margaret arrived with a brightness in her expression that suggested she too felt the lingering pleasure of accomplishment. The girl moved through her morning tasks with confidence, and Alice noticed how much she had grown in capability over the months they had worked together. Where once Margaret had been hesitant and uncertain, now she moved with assurance, understanding not just what to do, but why it should be done. The guests who had dined at the castle the previous evening departed after breaking their fast, riding out through the gates with expressions of continued satisfaction and words of thanks for the hospitality they had received. Alice watched from the kitchen doorway as they mounted their horses, and she felt quietly pleased to have contributed to their good impression of the castle. The days that followed settled back into their established patterns. The weather continued its gradual shift towards spring, though winter still held firm enough that true warmth remained weeks away. The snow disappeared entirely from the courtyard, revealing the mud and stone beneath, and the daylight hours grew incrementally longer, the change noticeable only when Alice paused to consider how much later the sun was setting compared to the depths of winter. One morning, Alice decided to make a dish she associated with the coming change of seasons, a soup of early greens. Though the kitchen garden remained largely dormant, there were a few hardy plants that had survived the winter and were beginning to show new growth. She sent Peter to gather what he could find: tender young leaves of sorrel, the first shoots of wild garlic that grew along the garden's edge, a handful of early parsley that had been protected under straw. The greens he brought back were precious in their scarcity, harbingers of the abundance that would come later when the garden fully awakened. Alice washed them carefully, examining each leaf, appreciating their fresh brightness after months of dried and stored foods. She made a simple broth of chicken and onions, cooking it slowly until the flavors were well developed, then straining it to achieve clarity. The greens were added just before serving, wilting quickly in the hot liquid and turning it a delicate green. The soup was light and clean tasting, and it seemed to carry with it a promise of warmer days ahead. The household received the soup with evident pleasure, and several people commented on the taste of fresh greens after the long winter. Alice felt satisfied by these reactions, pleased to have marked the seasonal shift in this small but meaningful way. In the afternoons, when the main work of the day was complete, Alice found herself taking on a project she had been contemplating for some time. She wanted to teach Margaret not just individual dishes and techniques, but the underlying principles that governed good cooking, the relationships between ingredients, the ways that heat transformed food, the importance of balance and proportion. They sat together at the kitchen table, and Alice would pose questions or situations for Margaret to consider. If a soup is too salty, what might you add to balance it? She would ask. Or why does meat need to rest after cooking? Or how can you tell if bread dough has been kneaded sufficiently? Margaret would answer, sometimes correctly and sometimes not, and Alice would guide her toward understanding, explaining the reasoning behind techniques that might seem arbitrary without context. These sessions felt important to Alice, felt like a more complete form of teaching than simply demonstrating tasks and having them repeated. "You're teaching me to think like a cook," Margaret observed one afternoon, "not just to follow instructions." "Yes," Alice confirmed. "That's exactly it. Instructions can teach you to make one specific dish, but understanding principles allows you to adapt, to solve problems, to create. That's the difference between someone who can follow a recipe and someone who truly knows their craft." The girl seemed to absorb these lessons eagerly, asking questions that showed she was thinking deeply about what she was learning. Alice found great satisfaction in this teaching, in watching Margaret's understanding deepen and her confidence grow. The kitchen itself seemed to reflect this period of relative calm and steady work. The stores, though diminished from their autumn abundance, remained adequate. The equipment was in good repair, the result of continuous maintenance and care. The rhythms of daily meals proceeded smoothly, each day's work building naturally on what had come before. One evening, as Alice was preparing a simple roasted chicken for dinner, Father Benedict appeared again at the kitchen door. He carried a bundle wrapped in cloth, which he set carefully on the table. "I've finished the Psalter," he said, and there was quiet pride in his voice. "I wanted you to see it since your honey contributed to its completion." He unwrapped the bundle to reveal a book, its pages of vellum covered with careful script and illuminated with decorated initial letters that glowed with color and gold. Alice wiped her hands on her apron and approached to look more closely, and what she saw took her breath slightly. The work was exquisite, each letter formed with precision, each illumination showing plants and birds and geometric patterns in colors that seemed almost luminous. The gold leaf, applied with the honey Alice had provided, caught the kitchen's firelight and seemed to glow from within. "This is beautiful," she said softly. "Truly beautiful. How long did this take you?" "Nearly a year," Father Benedict replied. "Working a little each day, one page at a time. Much like your work in the kitchen, actually. Steady attention over time, each small task contributing to a larger whole." Alice nodded, seeing the truth in the comparison. Different crafts, different materials, but the same underlying approach: patience, attention to detail, and the accumulation of small efforts into something substantial and worthwhile. "Thank you for showing me this," she said. "It's a privilege to see such work." After the priest had carefully rewrapped his psalter and departed, Alice found herself thinking about what he had said, about the parallels between his work and hers. Both required skill developed over time. Both demanded attention and care. Both created something that served a purpose beyond mere utility. His book would be used in worship, would last for generations, while her food nourished bodies and provided comfort and pleasure, even if its existence was temporary rather than permanent. There was dignity in all honest work, she thought, whether it produced objects that endured or experiences that were necessarily fleeting. The meals she prepared existed only briefly before being consumed, but while they existed, they mattered. They sustained life, they brought people together, they provided moments of satisfaction and pleasure. That was enough. That was more than enough. She finished preparing the evening's meal, the roasted chicken, accompanied by turnips mashed with butter and cream, by bread still warm from the oven, by a salad of preserved vegetables from the stores. It was simple food, honestly prepared, and when she served it to the household, she did so with the same attention and care she brought to the most elaborate formal dinner. That night, after the kitchen was cleaned and settled for the night, Alice stood at her window and looked out at the darkening sky. The stars were emerging, bright and distant, and she could hear the evening sounds of the castle, voices calling good night, doors closing, the settling sounds of a household preparing for rest. She thought about the passage of time, about how the winter was gradually releasing its grip, about how the year would continue its ancient cycle of seasons. She thought about Margaret's growing skill and the satisfaction of teaching. She thought about Father Benedict's beautiful psalter and the conversation about different crafts united by common principles of attention and care. And she thought about her own work, about the thousands of meals she had prepared in this kitchen, about the bread baked and the soup simmered and the roasts turned over countless fires. It was work that left no permanent monument, no object that would endure for future generations to admire. But it was work that mattered every single day, that contributed to the life and well-being of everyone in the castle. And in that daily matter, it had its own quiet significance. She turned from the window and prepared for bed, and when she lay beneath her blankets, she felt at peace with her place in the world, with the work she did and the life she lived. Tomorrow would bring more of the same work, and the day after, and the day after that, in an endless procession of meals and tasks and small, necessary acts of care. And that was exactly as it should be. Sleep came easily, deep and restorative, and Alice rested in the darkness while the castle slept around her, and the stars wheeled slowly overhead in their timeless patterns, and everything continued in its proper order, steady and reliable and good. The days continued to lengthen, each one bringing with it small signs of the seasons turning. Alice noticed these changes with the part of her awareness that had learned to read the world through years of attentive observation. The angle of light through the kitchen windows shifting gradually northward, the quality of the morning air becoming fractionally less sharp, the way the birds in the courtyard had begun to sing with more insistence at dawn. One particularly clear morning, she stood at the kitchen window after lighting the fire, looking out at the world awakening. The sky was pale with the approaching sunrise, and she could see the garden beyond the courtyard, still mostly bare but showing the first subtle hints of green, where the hardiest plants were beginning to stir from their winter dormancy. Margaret arrived and joined her at the window for a moment, both of them standing in companionable silence, simply observing the quiet beauty of the morning. Then, without needing to speak, they turned together to begin the day's work, Alice to the porridge pot, Margaret to the bread that waited to be sliced. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, spreading its warmth through the room. The water for the porridge began to heat, and Alice added the oats, stirring them gently as they started their slow transformation. Outside, the sun crested the horizon, sending golden light spilling across the courtyard and through the kitchen windows. Alice stirred the porridge, feeling the familiar resistance of the spoon moving through the thickening grain, and she found herself thinking about continuity, about how this simple act connected her to every cook who had ever stood in a kitchen and performed this same task. The work was ancient and ordinary and essential, and there was profound comfort in that. The porridge thickened properly, the oats becoming tender and creamy. Alice tasted a spoonful, found it good, and removed the pot from the direct heat. Soon people would arrive seeking breakfast, and she would serve them as she always did, and the day would unfold in its familiar patterns. Through the window, the light continued to grow, illuminating the kitchen with a gentle radiance. The fire burned steadily. The porridge waited in its pot, warm and ready. Margaret hummed quietly as she arranged bread on a platter. Everything was as it should be, ordered, peaceful, and suffused with the quiet contentment that came from work done well and days lived with attention and care. Alice stood at her table, her hands resting lightly on its worn surface, and felt the fullness of this moment, the warmth of the kitchen around her, the light streaming through the windows, the knowledge that her work mattered and would continue mattering day after day in the endless, beautiful rhythm of tending and feeding and nurturing life. And in that moment, in that kitchen, with the morning light spreading across the floor and the porridge waiting to be served, and the day stretching ahead with its familiar tasks and small satisfactions, everything was complete. Everything was enough. Everything was exactly as it needed to be.